It begins in silence. No explosions, no battles, no flags waving in victory. Just trains, miles of them, packed with people who didn't know they were heading to their deaths. The air smells of smoke and lies. And somewhere deep in the forests of Poland, men in black uniforms are building something the world has never seen before. A factory designed not to create, but to erase. Names, faces, families, all scheduled for deletion. They called it Operation Reinhard, a name that sounded bureaucratic, clean, official. But behind those words was the most efficient murder machine ever conceived by man. This wasn't chaos. It was organization. It wasn't rage. It was planning. Men sat at desks and drew blueprints for death, calculating how many could die per hour, how much gold could be stolen from the mouths of corpses, how much ash could be buried before the earth itself began to bleed. And as those trains rolled through the mist, as station masters pretended not to see, as the guards laughed over lunch while smoke rose from the tree lean, a nation was being turned into an industry of extermination. What took place here didn't just kill millions, it rewired the definition of evil. Operation Reinhard wasn't a battle. It was a system, a machine that fed on silence and obedience. And once it started, there was no sound loud enough in the world to stop it. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The idea before the killing. Operation Reinhard did not begin with camps, trains, or gas chambers. It began quietly, long before the first deportation order was typed, in the language of ideology and abstraction, where human beings were reduced to categories and problems to be solved. In the years before the Second World War, anti-Semitism in Europe was not new, but under National Socialism it was transformed from social prejudice into state doctrine, embedded into law, science, education, and governance, creating a worldview in which Jews were no longer seen as neighbors or citizens but as a biological threat to the German nation itself. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle did not invent hatred, but they systematized it, weaponizing centuries of conspiracy myths and racial pseudoscience to frame Jewish existence as an existential danger, something to be eliminated not through chaos or passion, but through planning. As the Nazi state consolidated power after 1933, exclusion became policy. Jewish professionals were purged, property was seized, civil rights were stripped away step by step, each decree carefully framed as legal necessity, until persecution became normalized and invisible to those who benefited from it. Violence escalated gradually, boycotts turned into arrests, arrests into forced emigration, and forced emigration into confinement. Yet even then, mass murder was not yet openly declared. Instead, the regime experimented with methods of removal, testing how far society could be pushed without resistance. The outbreak of war in 1939 radically expanded the scope of Nazi ambition, bringing millions of Jews under German control almost overnight, especially in occupied Poland, where Jewish populations were dense, visible, and deliberately isolated through the creation of ghettos that functioned as holding zones, temporary solutions for a problem the regime still claimed to be resolving. Inside the ghettos, starvation, disease, and overcrowding were not accidents but tools, policies designed to weaken, humiliate, and reduce life expectancy, while Nazi administrators debated future options in memoranda and meetings far removed from the suffering they engineered. It was during this period that the language of resettlement and evacuation became common in official correspondence, euphemisms that concealed intent while preparing bureaucratic pathways for something far more radical. At the same time, the Nazi regime was already killing on a massive scale elsewhere, refining techniques that would later feed directly into Operation Reinhard, the so-called T for Euthanasia program, which murdered tens of thousands of disabled Germans using carbon monoxide gas, provided the technical expertise, personnel, and psychological conditioning necessary for industrialized killing, demonstrating that murder could be routinized, hidden, and justified through medical and administrative framing. Doctors learned how to kill without emotion. Engineers learned how to construct sealed chambers. Clerks learned how to record deaths as statistics, and when public protests forced T4 to be officially halted, its methods did not disappear, they were simply redirected. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union and the radicalization of Nazi racial policy, mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen revealed both the regime's willingness to annihilate entire communities and the limitations of face-to-face killing. It was slow, psychologically taxing for perpetrators, and difficult to conceal. The solution, as Nazi planners increasingly believed, lay not in improvisation but in infrastructure, in fixed locations, away from cities, connected to rail lines, where killing could occur continuously, efficiently, and invisibly. It was in this context that Operation Reinhard emerged, not as a sudden decision, but as the culmination of years of ideological conditioning, bureaucratic rehearsal, and technological experimentation. Named after Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination in 1942, the operation was entrusted to men already hardened by the T4 program, operating under the authority of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, with a mandate that was both explicit and unprecedented: to exterminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland completely, and to do so in absolute secrecy. Unlike later camps that combined labor and murder, the camps of Operation Reinhard would exist for one purpose alone: to kill and then to vanish. No records were to remain, no witnesses to survive, no physical traces to endure. This was genocide stripped of spectacle, reduced to logistics and procedure, carried out not in the frenzy of war but through schedules, quotas, and daily routines. Before the first shovel broke ground at Belzec, before Treblinka and Sobibor appeared on maps, the Holocaust had already crossed a threshold, from persecution to annihilation, driven not by chaos but by planning, not by rage but by order. And once that system was set in motion, it would move with terrifying speed, consuming lives faster than history could record them, leaving behind a silence the Nazis believed would last forever. Chapter 1, Segment 2. From Theory to Decision. By late 1941, the Nazi leadership stood at a crossroads that would define the remainder of the war and permanently scar human history, because the question of what to do with Europe's Jews could no longer be deferred, disguised, or managed through temporary measures. The ghettos were overflowing, disease was rampant, food supplies were collapsing, and German administrators in occupied Poland were openly complaining that the so-called Jewish question was becoming unmanageable. Millions of people had been deliberately concentrated into sealed urban zones with no long-term plan for survival, and what had once been framed as containment was now widely acknowledged, even within Nazi correspondence, as an unsustainable dead end. At the same time, the invasion of the Soviet Union had radically accelerated Nazi racial policy. Behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen units were murdering entire Jewish communities in mass shootings that left ravines filled with bodies and local populations traumatized into silence. These killings demonstrated that the regime was fully committed to annihilation, but they also revealed serious problems: ammunition shortages, logistical delays, psychological strain on the shooters, and the growing risk that mass graves and eyewitnesses would undermine secrecy. Reports sent back to Berlin made it clear that while mass murder was already underway, it was inefficient, messy, and difficult to conceal on the scale the leadership now envisioned. The solution, increasingly discussed in SS and police circles, was to replace decentralized killing with a centralized system, one that would remove emotion from the process and transform genocide into an industrial routine. This shift did not happen in a single meeting or document, but through a series of overlapping decisions, approvals, and quiet understandings, culminating in what would later be known as the final solution, formally articulated at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, though the killing had already begun. Wannsee did not debate whether Jews should be murdered. That decision was already assumed. Instead, it coordinated how the murder would be organized across ministries, rail authorities, and occupied territories, ensuring that genocide would function smoothly across the entire Nazi state apparatus. Within this framework, Operation Reinhard was conceived as the practical engine of extermination for occupied Poland, the region with the largest Jewish population and the least international visibility. The choice of Eastern Poland was deliberate. Remote, heavily controlled, and already brutalized by years of occupation, it offered ideal conditions for secrecy. Small villages, forests, and railway junctions could be repurposed into killing centers with minimal oversight and no surviving local Jewish communities to raise alarm afterward. The men tasked with implementing the operation were not battlefield commanders but administrators of death. Figures like Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader in the Lublin district, whose career had already demonstrated a willingness to combine ideological fanaticism with ruthless efficiency. Under his authority, planning moved rapidly from concept to execution, with former T4 personnel reassigned eastward, bringing with them hard-earned experience in gas technology, deception, and the bureaucratic handling of corpses. The camps envisioned under Operation Reinhard were fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. They were not prisons, not labor centers, and not even concentration camps in the traditional sense. They were designed solely to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, with minimal personnel and maximum secrecy. Every element was calculated: the location near rail lines, the camouflage of buildings, the use of euphemistic signage, the scripted lies told to victims upon arrival. Deportation orders were issued under the guise of resettlement to the east, and Jewish councils in the ghettos were coerced into compiling lists, organizing transports, and maintaining order, often under the threat of collective punishment, forcing victims into impossible moral positions that would haunt survivors for decades. Trains were scheduled with the precision of commercial freight, coordinated by the Reichsbahn, whose clerks treated human beings as cargo measured in units and timetables. The very banality of this process was its most terrifying feature. Genocide did not disrupt daily German life, it was integrated into it. As construction plans were finalized and materials requisitioned, secrecy became paramount. Workers were sworn to silence, local populations were misled, and official paperwork was deliberately vague or destroyed. Even within the Nazi hierarchy, knowledge was compartmentalized. Many participants understood only their specific task, not the full scope of the operation, allowing individuals to claim ignorance while contributing to mass murder. By the time the first camp at Belzec began operations in early 1942, the transition from ideology to action was complete. What had once been abstract hatred, debated in pamphlets and speeches, had now been transformed into a physical system of extermination, one that would function with relentless speed, murdering entire communities within hours of arrival and erasing their existence from the administrative record as efficiently as their bodies would soon be erased from the earth. Operation Reinhard was no longer a plan. It was a machine warming up, and once it began running, it would not stop until millions were dead and the forests of Poland were filled with ashes instead of names. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Blueprint of Erasure. By early 1942, the ideological, administrative, and logistical foundations of Operation Reinhard had fused into something unprecedented. A program whose sole purpose was not control, exploitation, or imprisonment, but total annihilation followed by deliberate disappearance. Unlike later camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, which combined forced labor and mass murder, the Reinhard camps were conceived as places people would enter and almost never leave alive, often within hours. The planners understood that killing millions of people would not be enough. The evidence of those killings, bodies, possessions, witnesses, even memory, would also have to be eliminated. This obsession with erasure shaped every design choice from the very beginning. The camps would be small, temporary, and deceptively ordinary, hidden in forests or near rural rail junctions, far from major cities and foreign observers. They would leave no ruins impressive enough to draw attention, no surviving prisoner population large enough to testify, and no paper trail that could be easily reconstructed after the war. In this sense, Operation Reinhard was not only a project of mass murder, but a project of historical deletion. The blueprint for this erasure came directly from the Nazi euthanasia program known as Action T4, which had already perfected techniques for killing civilians deemed unworthy of life through carbon monoxide gas, medical deception, and bureaucratic camouflage. When public protests forced T4 underground in 1941, its personnel were quietly transferred east, bringing with them a grim expertise in how to kill efficiently and invisibly. Engineers, doctors, and SS officers who had supervised gas chambers disguised as shower rooms in Germany now applied those same methods on a vastly larger scale. The language they used reflected this chilling continuity. Victims were referred to as units, killings as special treatment, and bodies as material. Murder had become a technical problem to be solved, not a moral one to be questioned. Construction plans for the first camp, Belzec, reflected this ruthless pragmatism. Rather than monumental architecture, the camp consisted of simple wooden structures, barbed wire fences camouflaged with pine branches, and a single narrow path, later known by survivors as the tube or schlouch, that led victims from the unloading platform to the gas chambers. This path was designed to prevent panic, confusion, or resistance by ensuring that those being killed never saw what lay ahead. Everything was engineered to keep people calm for as long as possible. Signs promising baths and disinfection, orders to remember luggage numbers for later retrieval, and SS guards trained to shout instructions rather than threats. Speed was essential. The faster a transport could be processed, the fewer guards were needed, the less chance there was of revolt, and the more trains could be handled per day. The selection of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka followed the same logic. Each site was close enough to major Jewish population centers to minimize transport time, yet isolated enough to ensure secrecy. Rail lines were extended directly into the camps so trains could arrive without passing through towns. Surrounding forests absorbed sound, smoke, and later, the stench of mass graves. Nearby non-Jewish villages were either coerced into silence or kept deliberately ignorant, told only that a military facility or labor camp was operating nearby. Even many German soldiers stationed in the region had no clear idea what was happening beyond the fences. Silence was not only enforced, it was engineered. At the same time, a parallel system of plunder was being organized with equal precision. Victims arrived carrying clothing, jewelry, documents, family photographs, and the remnants of entire lives. Nothing was to be wasted. Special units sorted belongings immediately after killings, separating gold teeth, watches, hair, and currency for shipment back to the Reich. Clothing was disinfected and redistributed to German civilians bombed out of their homes. Even ashes would later be sifted for traces of precious metals. In this way, genocide became economically integrated into the Nazi war effort, turning human destruction into material gain. The victims were murdered, stripped, burned, and redistributed into the German economy, leaving behind no physical trace that they had ever existed as individuals. Crucially, Operation Reinhard relied not only on German perpetrators but on a forced hierarchy of victimized labor. A small number of Jewish prisoners were selected upon arrival to perform the tasks that made the system function: cutting hair, dragging bodies, cleaning gas chambers, sorting belongings, and burying or burning the dead. These Sonderkommando units lived under constant threat of execution and were periodically murdered and replaced to eliminate witnesses. Their existence was itself part of the erasure strategy, forcing victims to participate in the destruction of their own communities, while ensuring that those who knew the most were least likely to survive. This psychological cruelty was not accidental. It was a deliberate feature of the system. As Belzec began operations in March 1942, the results were immediately apparent to its architects. Entire transports disappeared without incident. No letters came back. No labor reports were required. The ghettos emptied faster than expected. What had once been discussed in abstract terms was now a functioning prototype of industrialized murder. Within weeks, plans accelerated for Sobibor and Treblinka, each designed to increase capacity, reduce bottlenecks, and refine the killing process further. Improvements were noted, discussed, and implemented like upgrades to a factory line. The human cost was not a consideration. Efficiency was the only metric that mattered. By the end of this phase, the machinery of Operation Reinhard was fully assembled, not just as a set of camps, but as a closed-loop system of deportation, deception, extermination, and erasure. Trains arrived full and left empty. Paperwork was minimized. Bodies vanished. Names disappeared. Communities that had existed for centuries were reduced to smoke, ash, and confiscated property within weeks. What remained was silence, exactly as planned. And as this system expanded, its architects believed they had solved what they called the Jewish question, not only physically, but historically. The goal was not just to kill the victims, but to ensure that nothing remained to testify that they had ever lived at all. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Inside the mechanism of death, Belzec begins. When Belzec became operational in March 1942, the camp did not announce itself with watchtowers, slogans, or long lines of prisoners in striped uniforms. Instead, it functioned like a sealed machine whose purpose was concealed beneath routine, deception, and speed, and from the moment the first transports arrived, the system revealed how thoroughly the Nazis had engineered mass murder into a process that could operate almost invisibly, day after day, without interruption. Trains carrying Jews from the Lublin district in Galicia rolled into a small siding disguised as a transit point, where victims were ordered to disembark under the supervision of SS men and Ukrainian guards trained to shout instructions with rehearsed indifference rather than open brutality, creating an atmosphere of forced normalcy that suppressed panic just long enough for the process to continue. Men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, all were told they had arrived at a labor camp or a resettlement center, and signs promised bathing facilities, food, and onward transport, while loudspeakers issued calm commands to leave luggage behind, remember suitcase numbers, and proceed in orderly fashion, all lies carefully calibrated to keep people compliant for the few minutes they remained alive. Within moments of arrival, families were torn apart as men were separated from women and children, not for labor selection, but simply to move bodies through the system more efficiently. Any resistance was met with immediate violence, yet even this violence was not chaotic but procedural, designed to eliminate disruption rather than express rage. Victims were forced to undress in barracks built to resemble shower facilities, where guards emphasized cleanliness and speed, mocking the idea of hygiene even as they prepared people for death, while a small group of Jewish prisoners, already broken by terror and aware of what awaited them, were compelled to assist in shaving hair, collecting clothing, and moving the naked victims forward, knowing that their own lives depended on obedience and that they would eventually be murdered as well. From the undressing area, victims were driven down a narrow fenced corridor camouflaged with branches, the so-called tube, which curved deliberately to prevent anyone from seeing the gas chambers until it was too late, ensuring that fear erupted only at the final moment, when there was no longer space or strength to resist. The gas chambers themselves were crude, low-ceilinged rooms constructed of wood and concrete, sealed with heavy doors, into which dozens of people were packed so tightly that movement became impossible. Once filled, engines taken from captured Soviet tanks were started, pumping carbon monoxide into the chambers, and within minutes the screams, pounding, and choking subsided into silence, a process repeated over and over again as long as transports continued to arrive. Death at Belzec was measured not in days or weeks, but in minutes, and the camp's efficiency lay precisely in how quickly bodies could be processed, removed, and replaced by the next group. Once the gas cleared, Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to drag corpses out, disentangle bodies twisted together in death, remove gold teeth with pliers, and search mouths and clothing for hidden valuables, while SS overseers timed the work, beating or killing those who slowed the pace. At first, bodies were buried in massive mass graves dug nearby, but as decomposition created unbearable stench and threatened secrecy, the camp shifted to open-air cremation, stacking corpses on iron grates made from rail tracks, dousing them with fuel, and burning them day and night, the smoke rising above the surrounding forests as a grim signal that something unnatural was occurring, though few dared ask what. Throughout all of this, meticulous records were avoided. There were no prisoner registries, no work assignments, no long-term detention lists. People arrived, vanished, and were never documented as individuals, only as numbers in transport schedules and fuel calculations. Within weeks, Belzec had murdered hundreds of thousands of people, emptying entire towns and villages, while the outside world remained largely unaware of what was happening. And even within the Nazi system, knowledge was compartmentalized so that railway officials, local administrators, and guards could claim ignorance of the full picture. What made Belzec uniquely terrifying was not only the scale of killing, but the absolute finality of it. Fewer than a handful of prisoners would survive to testify, and the camp itself was never meant to endure, only to function until its task was complete and then disappear, leaving behind no witnesses, no ruins, and no evidence, only absence. In this way, Belzec marked the moment when genocide ceased to be improvised violence and became a perfected system, a model that would be replicated and expanded at Sobibor and Treblinka as Operation Reinhard accelerated toward its catastrophic peak. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The system perfected, routine, deception, and total erasure. As Belzec continued to operate through the spring and summer of 1942, the camp evolved from an experimental killing site into a fully synchronized extermination system, revealing how quickly mass murder could become routine once stripped of moral resistance and reframed as administrative necessity. And what emerged was not chaos but rhythm. A deadly cadence governed by train timetables, fuel deliveries, guard rotations, and the relentless arithmetic of bodies processed per day. Deportations intensified as ghettos across southeastern Poland were liquidated, with entire Jewish communities erased in a matter of hours, their populations loaded into overcrowded freight cars where many died before even reaching the camp, only to have their corpses unloaded alongside the living upon arrival, a detail that scarcely altered the procedure since Belzec made no distinction between the living and the dead beyond logistical convenience. SS commanders such as Christian Wirth refined their methods with cold precision, identifying bottlenecks, increasing chamber capacity, and streamlining corpse disposal, treating human beings as raw material to be moved, neutralized, and eliminated as efficiently as possible, while reports sent to higher authorities focused not on suffering but on throughput, fuel consumption, and operational success. Deception remained central to the process, not as a humane gesture but as a tool of control. Victims were kept calm through carefully rehearsed language, false promises of labor and resettlement, and even staged elements like fake train schedules and painted signs, all designed to prevent resistance that might slow the machinery of death. The guards themselves became functionaries of the system, many of them ordinary men whose primary concern was discipline and obedience rather than ideology, demonstrating how participation in genocide did not require fanaticism so much as compliance and distance from consequence as each individual task. Guarding a gate, shouting an order, driving a truck, could be rationalized as minor, disconnected, and necessary. Meanwhile, the Jewish forced laborers trapped within the camp existed in a state of suspended death, compelled to participate in the destruction of their own people under constant threat of execution, living with the knowledge that survival meant complicity and that their lives would end once they were no longer useful, a psychological torment as deliberate as any physical violence inflicted by the SS. The burning of bodies intensified as the scale of murder increased, with pyres operating continuously, day and night, filling the air with smoke and ash that settled over nearby villages, prompting rumors that something unspeakable was occurring, though fear and censorship ensured silence prevailed. To eliminate all traces, Operation 1005 was later introduced, forcing prisoners to exhume mass graves and burn decomposing corpses, grinding bones into fragments and scattering ashes, an act of secondary violence inflicted not only upon the dead but upon memory itself, as the Nazis sought to erase evidence of their crimes even as they continued committing them elsewhere. Belzec's isolation was deliberate. It was placed away from major population centers, guarded by secrecy, and excluded from official concentration camp lists, ensuring that even within Nazi Germany it remained obscure, a shadow operation whose success lay in invisibility. By the time deportations slowed in late 1942, the camp had fulfilled its purpose, having murdered an estimated 430,000 to 500,000 people, almost all of them Jews, with scarcely any survivors to bear witness, making Belzec not only one of the deadliest sites of the Holocaust but also one of the most effectively concealed. Unlike Auschwitz, which left behind ruins, records, and thousands of survivors, Belzec was designed to vanish, and its disappearance was not an accident but the final stage of its function. As buildings were dismantled, grounds plowed over, trees planted, and a farmhouse constructed to disguise the land, transforming a site of mass murder into an illusion of rural normalcy. In this way, Belzec embodied the ultimate goal of Operation Reinhard, not only the physical annihilation of a people, but the obliteration of proof, the erasure of witnesses, and the transformation of genocide into something that could be denied, minimized, or forgotten, leaving behind a silence so complete that for decades the world would struggle to comprehend how such an immense crime could occur almost without a trace. Chapter 2, Segment 3. The Disappearance. How a death camp was erased from the earth. By the end of 1942, Belzec had completed its assigned role within Operation Reinhard, and with chilling efficiency the Nazis moved to the final phase of its existence. Not closure, not liberation, but erasure, a deliberate attempt to make the camp, its victims, and the crime itself disappear as though it had never existed at all, demonstrating that destruction of memory was as essential to the system as murder itself. Once the last transports arrived and the final victims were killed, the SS began dismantling the infrastructure of death piece by piece, tearing down gas chambers, barracks, fences, and guard towers, salvaging usable materials to be shipped to other camps or reused elsewhere, treating the remains of an extermination center as nothing more than surplus construction supplies. Jewish forced laborers who had survived months of terror were compelled to exhume mass graves under the supervision of Operation 1005, dragging decomposed bodies from the earth, stacking them onto iron grates built from railway tracks, and burning them with gasoline and wood until nothing remained but ash and bone fragments, which were then crushed and scattered into the surrounding soil, rivers, and fields in a grotesque attempt to eliminate forensic evidence. These laborers, witnesses to the entire killing process, were themselves murdered once their task was complete, ensuring that almost no one who had seen Belzec in operation would live to speak of it, a strategy that succeeded so thoroughly that for years after the war historians struggled to reconstruct even the basic layout of the camp. To disguise the land, the SS planted trees and grass, leveled the terrain, and built a small farmhouse occupied by a Ukrainian guard and his family, creating the illusion of an ordinary rural property where, beneath the surface, hundreds of thousands of human remains were mixed with the soil. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, which were liberated before complete destruction, Belzec was erased before the tide of war turned decisively against Nazi Germany, leaving behind no ruins, no barracks, no gas chambers, and only a handful of survivor testimonies. So few that for decades denialists exploited the absence of physical remains to cast doubt on the camp's existence. The success of this concealment was so profound that Belzec faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by other camps with more survivors and more visible remnants, even though its death toll rivaled the most infamous sites of the Holocaust, a silence that reflected not only Nazi intent but post-war discomfort with confronting crimes that left so little tangible evidence. At the Nuremberg trials and subsequent investigations, Belzec received relatively limited attention compared to Auschwitz, in part because so many perpetrators had vanished, been reassigned, or blended back into civilian life, and because the documentation was intentionally sparse, reduced to transport lists, scattered correspondence, and fragments of testimony extracted years after the fact. Yet the absence of evidence was itself evidence of design, proof that Belzec had functioned exactly as intended, not as a camp of detention or labor, but as a temporary installation built solely to kill and then disappear, leaving behind only absence. In the decades that followed, survivors like Rudolf Redder and a handful of others struggled to make their voices heard, describing a place that no longer existed on maps. Their memories often questioned simply because the physical landscape had been so thoroughly altered, highlighting how denial thrives in the gaps left by destruction. It was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that sustained archaeological research, historical scholarship, and memorial efforts began to restore Belzec to the historical record, uncovering mass graves beneath the earth and reconstructing the camp's layout through painstaking analysis, finally confirming what survivors had always known, that beneath the quiet surface lay one of the most efficient killing sites ever created. Belzec's disappearance was not a failure of remembrance but a warning about how easily truth can be buried when systems of power control both violence and narrative, and how genocide does not end with death alone but continues through silence, denial, and forgetting, making the recovery of Belzec's story not only an act of historical scholarship but an act of moral resistance against the very erasure the Nazis sought to achieve. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Treblinka, the Factory of Immediate Death. By the summer of 1942, Operation Reinhard had reached its most lethal refinement, and Treblinka emerged as the purest expression of the Nazi vision for extermination. A place not of imprisonment, not of labor, not even of prolonged suffering, but of immediate disappearance, engineered so that human beings would pass through it like raw material through a machine and leave behind nothing but ash. Constructed deep in the forests of northeastern Poland near a small railway junction, Treblinka was deliberately isolated from population centers, chosen not for strategic value but for silence, secrecy, and speed, allowing transports to arrive continuously without drawing attention. Unlike Auschwitz, which combined labor exploitation with mass murder, Treblinka was designed with a single function: to kill every deportee as quickly and efficiently as possible, usually within 2 hours of arrival. There were no registration numbers, no camp tattoos, no long-term barracks for prisoners, only deception, movement, and death. Trains arrived packed beyond human capacity, carrying Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, Radom, Białystok, Lublin, and dozens of smaller communities, their passengers already weakened by starvation and terror, stepping onto a platform disguised as a rural transit station complete with false signs, painted clocks, and even a ticket window to reinforce the illusion of resettlement. SS officers and Ukrainian guards shouted orders with calculated calm, directing men and women to undress separately under the pretense of disinfection, while Sonderkommando prisoners, Jews forced to assist in the process, collected luggage, sorted clothing, and tried to avoid eye contact, knowing that any sign of hesitation could mean immediate execution. The architecture of Treblinka itself was built as a psychological weapon. Narrow fenced pathways known as the tube funneled naked victims directly from undressing barracks to gas chambers hidden behind trees, preventing escape, confusion, or resistance, turning movement itself into a mechanism of control. The gas chambers, initially powered by engine exhaust and later expanded to accommodate higher volumes, were crude but brutally effective, capable of killing thousands per day, with bodies removed within minutes by forced laborers who dragged corpses to mass graves, searching mouths for gold teeth and cutting hair from women before disposal. The speed of killing was so extreme that entire transports could vanish without leaving a trace in official records beyond a rail schedule, a design choice that ensured Treblinka would remain largely invisible even to many within the Nazi bureaucracy, its victims absorbed into the void. Guards were instructed to maintain a facade of routine, often using humor, insults, or false reassurances to prevent panic, while beatings and executions enforced absolute obedience, creating an atmosphere where terror and order coexisted seamlessly. The camp commandant, Franz Stangl, ran Treblinka not as a battlefield commander but as a manager, measuring success in numbers processed, efficiency improved, and disruptions minimized, demonstrating how genocide had become an administrative task rather than an act of rage. At its peak, Treblinka murdered between 8,000 and 12,000 people per day, surpassing any other single killing site in the Holocaust, a pace that forced continual expansion of burial pits and later mass cremation when decomposition threatened to expose the scale of the crime. Despite this relentless efficiency, cracks began to appear within the system as Sonderkommando prisoners, aware that survival was temporary and execution inevitable, began secretly sharing information, observing guard routines, and stealing weapons, planting the first fragile seeds of resistance in a place designed to erase all agency. Treblinka's existence demonstrated the horrifying culmination of Operation Reinhard, a camp so optimized for murder that human life became a logistical obstacle rather than a moral concern, proving that genocide, when systematized, no longer requires hatred at every step, only compliance, routine, and silence. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Life inside Treblinka. Survival without hope. Inside Treblinka, the concept of daily life barely existed, because time itself had been stripped of meaning, reduced to a relentless cycle of arrivals, killings, disposal, and preparation for the next transport, leaving those forced to work within the camp suspended in a state between existence and death where survival was measured in hours rather than days. The prisoners selected for labor, almost all of them Jews, were not spared because they were valued, but because the machinery of murder required human hands to function, creating a cruel paradox in which victims were compelled to sustain the system that was annihilating their own people. These men were organized into work details under constant threat, beaten for the smallest delay, executed without warning, and replaced immediately from new arrivals, ensuring that knowledge of the camp's full operation remained fragmented and short-lived. They sorted the belongings of the dead, hauling mountains of clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, and suitcases into storage barracks where everything was cataloged, packed, and shipped to Germany, turning the personal remnants of murdered families into state property, profit extracted from extermination. Others were forced into the most unbearable tasks, dragging corpses from gas chambers slick with blood and excrement, stacking bodies like timber, pulling out gold teeth with pliers, and transporting the dead to burial pits whose scale defied comprehension, trenches so vast they swallowed entire communities at once. The psychological toll of this labor was devastating, as prisoners lived with the knowledge that every face they saw entering the camp would soon be a body they would be ordered to move, and that their own deaths were merely postponed, not prevented. Food was scarce and deliberately insufficient, rations calculated to weaken without killing too quickly, keeping workers functional but perpetually exhausted, while disease spread rapidly in overcrowded barracks crawling with lice and filth, further thinning the population through neglect rather than direct execution. Violence was constant and arbitrary. Guards killed for sport, punishment, or boredom, reinforcing a reality where life had no value and fear became the primary instrument of control. Yet even within this engineered hell, traces of humanity persisted in fragile, almost invisible forms. Whispered prayers, shared memories of lost families, secret acts of kindness like saving a crust of bread or passing along information about guard movements. These small gestures were not acts of hope in the traditional sense. Hope was dangerous, often fatal, but acts of defiance against total dehumanization, a refusal to fully surrender identity in a place designed to erase it. Over time, the workers began to understand the full scope of Treblinka's purpose, realizing that no liberation was coming, that no prisoner would be allowed to survive as a witness, and that the camp itself was temporary, built to disappear once its task was complete. This knowledge transformed despair into something more volatile, a growing awareness that death was inevitable, but the manner of death was still a choice. As rumors spread of other camps being dismantled and mass graves being exhumed to burn bodies under Operation 1005, prisoners recognized the signs of impending erasure and understood that Treblinka would not be spared. When the killing slowed, it was not mercy but preparation for destruction. In this atmosphere of finality, the idea of resistance, Unthinkable at first in a place designed to crush all initiative, began to take shape, not as a dream of survival but as a final act of agency, a way to disrupt the machine and leave behind proof that Treblinka had existed, that its victims had not gone silently. The men who labored there lived in constant terror, but also with a growing clarity. If the Nazis intended to erase every trace of the camp and everyone inside it, then even a failed revolt, even a moment of chaos, could fracture the illusion of secrecy that Treblinka depended on. In this realization, forged through suffering beyond measure, the seeds of rebellion were planted, not in hope of victory, but in the belief that bearing witness, even through fire and blood, was the last form of resistance left to them. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Uprising, a revolt born from certainty. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka had begun to change in subtle but ominous ways, and the prisoners who remained, those few hundred men forced to operate the camp, understood what those changes meant with terrible clarity. The transports were slowing, the mass graves were being reopened, and the bodies of hundreds of thousands of murdered people were being exhumed and burned, not to honor the dead, but to erase them, to eliminate evidence before the camp itself would be dismantled and every living witness killed. This was the final phase of Treblinka's purpose, and the men inside knew they were no longer workers but liabilities. It was this certainty of annihilation that transformed fear into resolve, because once survival was no longer possible, resistance became the only remaining choice. Secretly, cautiously, under constant threat of execution, a small group of prisoners began to organize what would become one of the most desperate uprisings of the Holocaust. The resistance was not driven by illusions of escape or victory. It was driven by the need to disrupt the killing process, to burn the camp, and to ensure that Treblinka could not vanish without a trace. Weapons were nearly impossible to obtain, but through bribery, deception, and stolen access, the prisoners managed to acquire a small number of pistols, grenades, and tools, hiding them beneath floorboards and inside work sheds, knowing that discovery meant instant death. The plan was simple and suicidal. Seize the armory, kill as many guards as possible, set fire to the camp's infrastructure, and attempt a mass breakout through the fences, accepting that most would be shot but hoping that some might survive to tell the world what Treblinka had been. On August 2, 1943, the uprising began. Under the cover of routine work, prisoners moved into position, killing guards quietly with knives and axes, setting buildings ablaze as smoke rose over the camp for the first time not from cremation but from rebellion. Chaos erupted as gunfire spread, alarms sounded, and guards fired indiscriminately into crowds of fleeing prisoners, cutting down men as they ran toward the perimeter fences and minefields beyond. Flames consumed barracks, warehouses, and administrative buildings, destroying records and infrastructure that had facilitated murder on an industrial scale. In the confusion, approximately 300 prisoners managed to escape the camp, though most were later hunted down and killed by German forces and local collaborators, leaving only a few dozen survivors who would carry Treblinka's testimony into the post-war world. The uprising did not stop the Holocaust, but it shattered the secrecy surrounding Treblinka and proved that even in a place engineered to eliminate all resistance, defiance was still possible. In its aftermath, the Nazis accelerated their efforts to erase the camp completely, demolishing remaining structures, leveling the land, planting trees, and constructing a farmhouse to disguise the site, as if genocide could be buried beneath soil and silence. Yet Treblinka could not be fully erased, because the uprising ensured that witnesses survived, that testimony existed, and that the camp would eventually be uncovered as one of the central killing centers of Operation Reinhard. The rebellion stands not as a story of triumph, but as a declaration made in the face of certain death. That the victims of Treblinka were not passive, that they understood what was being done to them, and that even stripped of everything, families, names, futures, they chose to resist the machinery designed to erase their humanity. In the fire and gunshots of that August afternoon, Treblinka's purpose was briefly reversed. A camp built only for death became, for a moment, a place where human will confronted absolute evil, ensuring that history would remember not only how Treblinka killed, but how it failed to completely silence those it tried to destroy. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Erasing the Dead. Operation 1005 and the War Against Memory. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Nazi leadership understood something fundamental had changed. The war was no longer guaranteed to end in German victory, and with that realization came a new priority, not to stop killing but to conceal it. As Allied forces advanced and rumors of mass murder spread beyond occupied Poland, the SS initiated one of the most grotesque phases of the Holocaust, a systematic effort to erase the physical evidence of genocide itself. This effort became known as Operation 1005, a secret program designed to exhume mass graves, burn the bodies of murdered Jews, and obliterate all traces of extermination camps and execution sites across Eastern Europe. Nowhere was this effort more concentrated, more obsessive, or more desperate than within the camps of Operation Reinhard. At Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where nearly 2 million people had been murdered in a matter of months, the earth itself had become an archive of crime. Mass graves emitting the stench of decay, soil visibly shifting as bodies decomposed beneath it. These graves were not hidden accidents. They were known, mapped, and feared by the perpetrators themselves. The Nazis understood that if these sites were discovered intact, their claims of resettlement and labor transfer would collapse instantly. The solution was not to acknowledge the crimes, but to destroy the evidence with the same efficiency that had created it. Prisoners, almost all Jewish, were forced into Sonderkommando units tasked with reopening the mass graves, extracting decomposing corpses by hand, stacking them onto massive iron grates built from railway tracks, and burning them with wood, fuel, and the fat rendered from the bodies themselves. This work was conducted under constant guard, with beatings and executions used to enforce speed and silence. The psychological cruelty was total. Men were forced to handle the remains of entire communities, often recognizing clothing, faces, or family members among the dead, while being fully aware that once the task was completed, they too would be killed. At Treblinka, the original burial pits proved insufficient for concealment, and the SS ordered the construction of industrial-scale cremation platforms capable of incinerating thousands of bodies per day. Flames burned continuously, day and night, sending columns of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles, replacing secrecy with a new form of denial, one that assumed no one would dare question what they saw. At Belzec, the destruction was so complete that when Soviet investigators later arrived, they found almost no visible structures left standing, only ash mixed into the soil and fragments of bones scattered beneath layers of planted vegetation. Sobibor followed the same pattern. Buildings dismantled, fences removed, ground leveled, trees planted to simulate natural forest growth, as if murder could be overwritten by landscaping. Operation 1005 extended far beyond the death camps, reaching Einsatzgruppen massacre sites across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, where entire villages had been executed into ravines and pits. The objective was not merely concealment but historical annihilation, to ensure that no graves could testify, no numbers could be verified, and no physical proof could confront future denials. This was genocide followed by anti-genocide, a second crime layered atop the first, aimed not at bodies but at memory itself. Yet even this effort failed. Bones resisted complete combustion. Ash contaminated rivers and fields. Witnesses survived. Documents leaked. Prisoners escaped. And the scale of the operation itself, requiring thousands of guards, months of labor, and massive logistical coordination, became evidence of premeditation rather than concealment. Operation 1005 reveals a chilling truth about the Holocaust. The Nazis did not merely kill. They understood the moral weight of what they had done and sought to escape it through destruction of proof. This was not the behavior of a regime unaware of its crimes. It was the behavior of one fully conscious of them. The attempt to erase the dead became, paradoxically, one of the clearest demonstrations of guilt in modern history. And in the silence they tried to impose upon the earth, the Holocaust left its loudest accusation: that a system capable of murdering millions was also capable of lying about it, denying it, and attempting to bury truth itself beneath ash, soil, and fear. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Silence as Policy. Denial, Deception, and the Nazi War on Truth. As Operation 1005 advanced across occupied Europe, the Nazi regime entered a new and final phase of its genocidal system, one that no longer focused primarily on killing, but on controlling what would be remembered, recorded, and believed. By 1943, the Holocaust was no longer a secret known only to perpetrators and victims. Whispers had spread through occupied territories, reports had reached neutral nations, and even within Germany, soldiers returning from the East carried stories that could not be fully suppressed. Faced with the growing possibility that their crimes would be exposed, the Nazis transformed denial itself into policy. This was not simple propaganda. It was an organized, bureaucratic effort to rewrite reality in real time. Language became the first weapon. Official documents increasingly avoided explicit references to death, replacing them with euphemisms such as special treatment, evacuation, or resettlement. Deportation lists were framed as labor transfers. Camp records were destroyed or falsified. Even within the SS, information was compartmentalized so that individuals could claim ignorance of the larger system while still participating in it. This fragmentation of responsibility was deliberate. It ensured that no single person appeared to hold the entire truth, while collectively the system functioned with lethal precision. At the camps themselves, deception was built into every stage of extermination. Victims arriving at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were told they were entering transit camps. Fake train schedules were posted. Signs pointed to bathhouses. Orchestras were forced to play near killing sites to maintain calm. The goal was not mercy, but efficiency. Panic slowed the process, while belief made it seamless. Even after death, deception continued. Families who inquired about missing relatives received form letters claiming resettlement in the East or death from disease, complete with falsified dates and causes. Meanwhile, the physical transformation of extermination sites accelerated. Once killing operations slowed or ceased, camps were dismantled entirely. At Treblinka, barracks were torn down, mass graves leveled, and a farmhouse constructed to suggest agricultural use. Ukrainian guards were reassigned or executed. Jewish laborers involved in dismantling were murdered once their work was complete. Trees were planted to obscure disturbed soil. At Belzec, the destruction was so thorough that post-war investigators initially doubted the camp's true function due to the lack of visible remains. This absence was intentional. It was meant to create uncertainty, to make future accusations seem exaggerated or unprovable. The Nazis understood something deeply unsettling about human psychology. Doubt thrives in the absence of evidence, and silence creates space for denial. This strategy extended beyond physical destruction into diplomatic and legal realms. When confronted with reports of mass murder, Nazi officials dismissed them as enemy propaganda. They exploited the unprecedented scale of the crimes, knowing that many outside observers found it difficult to believe that an advanced European state could systematically murder millions of civilians. This disbelief became an unspoken ally. The regime relied on the world's reluctance to accept the unimaginable. Yet despite all efforts, the system of denial could not fully contain the truth. Survivors escaped. Polish resistance groups documented transports and killings. Underground couriers carried reports to London and Washington. By 1942, Allied leaders had credible intelligence confirming the extermination of Jews, though political and military responses remained limited. Inside the camps, prisoners began to understand that survival depended not only on living, but on leaving testimony behind. Some buried notes near killing sites. Others memorized names, dates, and procedures, determined that if they did not survive, memory would. The Nazis were fighting a war not only against people, but against history itself, and history was resisting. This segment of the Holocaust reveals one of its most chilling dimensions: the attempt to annihilate truth alongside human life. The regime did not simply murder. It sought to create a future in which those murders could be denied, minimized, or forgotten. This was genocide followed by epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge. And yet, the very scale of the deception, the obsessive need to erase every trace, stands today as proof of consciousness of guilt. Silence was never accidental. It was engineered. And in understanding that silence, we come closer to understanding how the Holocaust was not only carried out, but nearly hidden, and why remembrance remains an act of resistance against the system that tried to make the dead disappear forever. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The Aftermath of Erasure. Memory, Trials, and the Struggle to Name the Dead. When the killing camps of Operation Reinhard were dismantled and the last witnesses silenced, the Nazis believed they had succeeded not only in extermination, but in disappearance. What remained at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka after 1943 were not ruins like Auschwitz, but absences, fields, forests, and farms that gave no obvious indication of what had occurred beneath the soil. This absence shaped the post-war world in profound and troubling ways. When the war ended in 1945 and Allied forces began documenting Nazi crimes, Operation Reinhard initially stood at the margins of public understanding. There were no liberated prisoners marching out in front of cameras, no intact gas chambers to photograph, no piles of abandoned belongings to catalog on site. The very success of the Nazi erasure campaign delayed justice and distorted memory. Survivors who spoke of Treblinka or Belzec were often met with disbelief, not because their testimonies were weak, but because the physical evidence had been so thoroughly destroyed that even investigators struggled to reconstruct events. In Poland, Soviet authorities focused their attention on camps that still existed, while Western prosecutors prioritized crimes that left clearer documentary trails. As a result, the Reinhard camps, where nearly 2 million people were murdered, became paradoxically among the least understood sites of the Holocaust for decades. The trials that did occur reflected this imbalance. At Nuremberg, Operation Reinhard was mentioned, but rarely explored in detail. Key architects such as Odilo Globoknik were dead by suicide. Many mid-level perpetrators reintegrated into civilian life, protected by the chaos of post-war Europe and the lack of surviving documentation. In West Germany, early investigations into Belzec and Sobibor stalled repeatedly due to claims of insufficient evidence, faded memories, and the absence of bodies. It was not until the 1960s, driven by survivor persistence and a generational shift within German society, that serious prosecutions resumed. The Sobibor trial in Hagen and later investigations into Treblinka forced courts to confront crimes that had been deliberately designed to leave no trace. Judges and prosecutors were compelled to rely almost entirely on survivor testimony, a burden that placed immense emotional weight on those who had already endured the unimaginable. Survivors were asked not only to remember, but to prove again and again that their suffering had been real. At the same time, historians began piecing together the story through fragmented sources. Railway schedules, SS personnel files, construction records, and intercepted communications. What emerged was a clearer picture of Operation Reinhard as a centralized, methodical system, not a series of isolated atrocities. Archaeological investigations decades later confirmed mass graves at Belzec and Treblinka, validating survivor accounts with physical evidence long thought lost. Memorials were eventually constructed, not to recreate what had been destroyed, but to acknowledge absence itself. At Belzec, the memorial landscape is deliberately abstract, a fractured terrain of stone and pathways that forces visitors to confront disorientation rather than spectacle. Treblinka's field of stones, each bearing the name of a vanished community, stands as a counter to the Nazi attempt to erase identities along with lives. Yet the struggle over memory has never truly ended. Holocaust denial and distortion continue to exploit the very gaps the Nazis engineered, using the lack of ruins and photographs as tools of false skepticism. This makes Operation Reinhard especially vulnerable to manipulation, and especially important to understand. The history of these camps teaches that genocide does not require visibility to be real, and that absence can itself be evidence of intent. In confronting the aftermath of erasure, we see how the Holocaust did not conclude with liberation, but extended into decades of silence, denial, and delayed recognition. Remembering Operation Reinhard is therefore not only an act of historical reconstruction, but a moral obligation to restore names where numbers were imposed, to affirm truth where silence was planned, and to recognize that the dead were not lost to history, they were deliberately hidden from it. This final phase of the system failed in its ultimate goal. The camps vanished, but memory endured. And in that endurance lies the defeat of the machinery that tried to make murder permanent and forgetting complete. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Resistance inside the machinery, when death camps faced defiance. By the time Operation Reinhard reached its most lethal efficiency, the Nazi system believed resistance inside the extermination camps was impossible, not merely unlikely. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were engineered to prevent organization, memory, and hope. Prisoners were starved, isolated, constantly rotated, and murdered in waves designed to eliminate witnesses. Guards relied on terror, randomness, and exhaustion to keep the doomed compliant. And yet, even within this architecture of total annihilation, resistance emerged, not as an organized army, but as fragile, desperate acts of human will against a system designed to erase will itself. Resistance inside the Reinhard camps did not resemble partisan warfare or armed revolt in the traditional sense. It took the form of whispered warnings, smuggled messages, stolen tools, sabotaged machinery, and ultimately, open rebellion when survival was no longer an option. In these camps, resistance was not about victory. It was about refusal to die silently, refusal to let the Nazis control the final meaning of Jewish existence. The conditions under which this resistance formed were almost unimaginable. Prisoners selected for labor, sorting belongings, cutting hair, operating engines, burying bodies, understood that their lives were temporary. They saw transports arrive daily, watched families disappear into gas chambers within hours, and knew that once their usefulness ended, they would follow. This knowledge created a brutal clarity. Survival was an illusion, but choice still existed. In Treblinka, by late 1942, rumors of liquidation spread among the work prisoners. Deportations had slowed, and the SS began replacing Jewish laborers with new arrivals, a clear sign that witnesses were being eliminated. A clandestine resistance group formed around a core of prisoners who had access to weapons storage areas, workshops, and administrative zones. Men like Dr. Julian Korozicki, Samuel Willenberg, and others risked immediate execution simply by speaking to one another in secrecy. They collected money from confiscated valuables to bribe guards, stole weapons piece by piece, and coordinated across labor details using coded phrases and gestures. In Sobibor, resistance developed differently but with equal courage. The arrival of Soviet Jewish POWs in 1943, men with military experience, changed the psychological balance of the camp. Under the leadership of Alexander Petchersky and Leon Feldhendler, a plan emerged that was both simple and nearly suicidal. lure SS officers into workshops one by one, kill them silently, seize weapons, and lead a mass escape before reinforcements arrived. The plan depended on absolute secrecy and perfect timing in a place where discovery meant immediate death. Prisoners rehearsed quietly, memorized routes, and prepared themselves mentally for failure. On October 14, 1943, the Sobibor uprising unfolded with terrifying speed. Several SS officers were killed with axes and knives. Alarms sounded sooner than planned, chaos erupted, and hundreds of prisoners rushed the fences under gunfire and mines. Approximately 300 escaped the camp. Most were later hunted down and killed, but dozens survived the war. Their survival shattered the Nazi illusion of total control. Treblinka's uprising followed a similar arc on August 2, 1943. Fires were set, weapons seized, and prisoners charged the gates amid gunfire. The camp was partially destroyed in the chaos. Though the majority of escapees were killed, the rebellion achieved its strategic purpose. Treblinka ceased operations soon afterward. Belzec, by contrast, saw no large-scale uprising. Not because resistance did not exist, but because the camp was dismantled so quickly and left almost no survivors capable of organizing revolt. Even so, acts of defiance occurred in smaller, quieter forms. Refusing orders, sabotaging equipment, maintaining religious rituals, preserving names and stories when the Nazis sought to reduce people to ash. These uprisings did not stop Operation Reinhard, but they exposed its vulnerability. They proved that even in a system built solely for death, human agency could not be fully extinguished. The Nazis responded with fury, accelerating camp closures, intensifying cover-up efforts, and murdering remaining witnesses. But the damage was done. Survivors carried these stories beyond the camps, ensuring that Operation Reinhard would not vanish into silence as intended. Resistance in the Reinhard camps forces a profound reevaluation of what resistance means. It was not measured in military success, but in moral rupture, moments where victims seized authorship over their final actions. These revolts did not defeat the system, but they denied it absolute victory. They stand as some of the most extraordinary acts of defiance in human history, not because they were large, but because they occurred where resistance was meant to be impossible. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Erasing the Evidence. Operation 1005 and the Nazi War Against Memory. As Operation Reinhard neared its murderous conclusion, the Nazi leadership faced a new and dangerous problem. Not moral reckoning, but exposure. By late 1942 and into 1943, reports from the Eastern Front made it clear that Germany might not win the war quickly, and that the territories where mass murder had been carried out could one day fall into enemy hands. The extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had already fulfilled their primary function. Nearly 2 million people had been murdered with industrial efficiency. Now the Reich turned to a second phase just as deliberate and systematic, the erasure of the crime itself. This effort became known as Operation 1005, a secret campaign designed to eliminate physical evidence of mass murder and silence the land itself. Under the direction of SS officer Paul Blobel, previously a commander of Einsatzgruppen death squads, special units were formed to exhume mass graves across occupied Eastern Europe. At Reinhard sites, this meant reopening pits filled with tens or hundreds of thousands of decomposing bodies. Jewish prisoners, often those already condemned to death, were forced to dig up corpses with their bare hands, stack them onto massive pyres built from railway tracks, and burn them day and night under armed guard. The air filled with smoke thick with human ash, a smell survivors later said never left their lungs or memories. Bones that failed to burn completely were crushed manually with mallets or ground into powder using improvised machines. Ashes were scattered into rivers, fields, and forests, deliberately mixed into soil to prevent detection. At Belzec, where almost no survivors remained, The camp was dismantled entirely. Barracks were torn down, mass graves emptied, and the land leveled. Trees were planted. A farmhouse was built and handed to a Ukrainian guard, creating the illusion of an ordinary rural landscape. Sobibor followed a similar fate after the 1943 uprising. The camp was razed, the ground plowed, and pine saplings planted in neat rows. Treblinka, after its revolt, was destroyed even more aggressively. Buildings were demolished, tracks removed, and the site transformed into farmland, complete with a fake manor house meant to discourage curiosity. The Nazis believed that without ruins, witnesses, or documents, the camps would dissolve into rumor. Operation 1005 was not limited to camps. It extended to ravines, forests, and fields across Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, where Einsatzgruppen had carried out mass shootings. Everywhere, the same process unfolded: forced exhumation, burning, crushing, dispersal. The psychological cruelty of this phase cannot be overstated. Prisoners were compelled to destroy the remains of their own families and communities, fully aware that once their task was complete, they too would be killed. And they were. Sonderkommando units assigned to corpse disposal were regularly executed and replaced to prevent testimony. Yet, despite these efforts, the erasure was incomplete. The scale of murder was too vast, the time too short, the secrecy too fragile. Fragments remained. Burned bones overlooked, documents misfiled, survivors who escaped, local civilians who saw and remembered. The very urgency of Operation 1005 betrayed Nazi fear. Fear that history would judge them, fear that memory could not be fully destroyed. Ironically, the attempt to erase evidence became evidence itself. Post-war investigators uncovered traces of mass cremation sites, ash-filled soil, and eyewitness accounts that matched survivor testimony with chilling precision. At Treblinka, archaeologists decades later identified foundations of gas chambers long after the Nazis claimed the camp had never existed. Operation 1005 also revealed a deeper truth about the Holocaust. Genocide did not end with death. It extended into a war against remembrance, an effort to control not just who lived and died, but what the future would know. The Nazis understood that memory is power, that naming a crime keeps it alive. Their failure to fully erase Operation Reinhard stands as a testament to the resilience of truth. Even when bodies were burned and buildings erased, the crime remained etched into landscapes, documents, and human testimony. This phase of the Holocaust forces a confrontation with the idea that genocide seeks not only to kill people, but to kill history itself. And yet, despite all efforts to annihilate evidence, Operation Reinhard did not vanish. It survived in fragments, in scars, and in voices that refused to be silenced, proving that memory, once awakened, is harder to destroy than any structure built for death. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Aftermath, Trials, and the Shadow That Never Lifted. When Operation Reinhard formally ended in late 1943, the Nazi leadership declared its most secret extermination program complete. Belzec was already erased, Sobibor dismantled after the uprising, and Treblinka reduced to a scarred field disguised as farmland. Nearly 2 million people had been murdered, and the machinery that made it possible had been dismantled, repurposed, or absorbed into other branches of the SS. Yet the end of the camps did not mean the end of their consequences. What followed was a long, uneven reckoning, one shaped by denial, silence, selective justice, and the painful persistence of memory. As the war turned decisively against Germany, many of the men who had built and operated the Reinhard camps were reassigned to other killing fronts or fled westward, blending into collapsing military units or civilian populations. Some were killed in battle. Others vanished into post-war Europe under assumed identities. A small number were captured and brought before courts, but the scale of accountability never matched the scale of the crime. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the world's attention focused on the ruins of Auschwitz and the revelations of the Nuremberg trials, while Operation Reinhard, designed from the beginning to leave no witnesses, remained partially hidden. The camps had produced almost no survivors, and the Nazis had destroyed documents with obsessive thoroughness. As a result, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka lingered on the margins of public understanding, known in outline but rarely examined in full detail. The trials that did occur were fragmented and delayed. In Poland, some guards and collaborators were prosecuted in the late 1940s, but Cold War politics soon shifted priorities. In West Germany, meaningful investigations into Reinhard personnel did not begin until the 1960s, spurred by a new generation unwilling to accept silence as closure. The Treblinka trials in Dusseldorf, beginning in 1964, revealed horrifying details of daily operations. Gas chamber procedures, beatings, executions, and the casual cruelty of guards, but sentences were often light, constrained by legal definitions that struggled to encompass genocide. Many defendants claimed they were following orders, that they had little choice, that the camps were not real concentration camps. Courts, bound by narrow interpretations of individual guilt, frequently accepted these defenses. Of the dozens of men involved in Operation Reinhard, only a handful served significant prison time. Christian Wirth, the brutal architect of the camps, had already been killed in 1944 by Yugoslav partisans, escaping trial entirely. Odilo Glaboknik committed suicide in British custody in 1945. Others lived quietly into old age. For survivors and historians, this imbalance between crime and punishment became another wound, proof that justice, like memory, could be uneven and fragile. Yet even as legal accountability faltered, historical truth slowly asserted itself. Testimonies from the very few survivors, men like Rudolf Ritter of Belzec or Thomas Blatt of Sobibor, became invaluable, offering first-hand accounts of places the Nazis tried to erase. Local Polish villagers spoke of smoke, screams, and trains that arrived full and left empty. Archaeological investigations decades later uncovered mass graves, foundations of gas chambers, and personal objects buried beneath layers of soil and denial. These findings shattered lingering claims that the camps were exaggerated or invented. Memorials were eventually built, not on the original timelines of justice, but on the persistence of remembrance. Treblinka's memorial, with its field of shattered stones, stands where the camp once operated, naming destroyed communities instead of perpetrators. Belzec's memorial, stark and fractured, forces visitors to walk through crushed stone and ash, confronting absence as presence. Sobibor's site, long neglected, has been re-examined and reinterpreted, with new discoveries continuing into the 21st century. These places exist not as ruins preserved by accident, but as reconstructions wrested back from attempted oblivion. The legacy of Operation Reinhard is therefore not confined to the years 1942 and 1943. It extends into the moral architecture of the modern world. It demonstrates how genocide can be engineered quietly, efficiently, and bureaucratically, how murder can be hidden behind timetables, requisition forms, and euphemisms like resettlement. It also reveals how denial can persist long after gunfire stops, how absence of evidence can be weaponized, and how justice can be delayed by convenience and fear. Yet it also shows the endurance of truth. Despite total secrecy, despite near-total extermination of witnesses, despite systematic erasure, Operation Reinhard did not disappear. It survived in fragments of testimony, in disturbed soil, in the memories of those who saw trains vanish into forests and never return. The Nazis failed in their final objective, to kill memory itself. Today, Operation Reinhard stands as one of the clearest warnings in human history, not because it was uniquely monstrous, but because it was frighteningly methodical. It reminds us that genocide does not require chaos. It requires organization, obedience, and indifference. And it leaves behind a question that echoes far beyond the camps themselves. If such a system could be built once, step by step, behind closed doors and euphemistic language, what responsibility does the present bear to recognize the early signs before silence becomes complicity again? Chapter 6, Segment 1. Memory against erasure. How Operation Reinhard was almost forgotten. In the years immediately following the collapse of Nazi Germany, the physical remnants of Operation Reinhard were already disappearing, just as their architects had intended. Unlike Auschwitz, which the SS abandoned in haste, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had been dismantled deliberately and systematically while the war was still ongoing. Buildings were torn down, bricks reused, mass graves dug up and burned, ashes crushed and scattered, trees planted to disguise killing grounds, and small farms established to give the appearance of normal rural life. The goal was not only to destroy evidence, but to destroy memory itself, to ensure that future generations would find nothing to point to, nothing to photograph, nothing to mourn. When Soviet and Allied investigators began documenting Nazi crimes, they encountered vast extermination complexes in the West, but little more than rumors, survivor whispers, and scarred earth in the forests of eastern Poland. Operation Reinhard had functioned with extreme secrecy, producing almost no survivors and leaving behind very few documents. As a result, for many years it existed in public consciousness as a shadowy footnote rather than the core of the Holocaust's killing process. This absence created fertile ground for denial, distortion, and neglect. In the early Cold War period, geopolitical priorities overshadowed the pursuit of comprehensive justice. Poland fell behind the Iron Curtain, cutting off sites, archives, and witnesses from Western researchers. West Germany focused on reconstruction and political stability, often at the expense of confronting the full scope of Nazi crimes. Many former perpetrators reintegrated quietly into civilian life, protected by legal loopholes, societal silence, or the convenient narrative that responsibility belonged only to a few top leaders. Within this environment, Operation Reinhard became the Holocaust's most murdered and least remembered chapter. Yet memory did not vanish, it survived in fragments. Survivors such as Rudolf Redder, one of the only known people to escape Belzec alive, testified despite skepticism and indifference. Former forced laborers from Sobibor and Treblinka recorded their stories, often decades later, haunted by the knowledge that entire families, towns, and cultures had been annihilated with almost no trace. Polish villagers passed down stories of trains that arrived full and departed empty, of smoke that smelled unlike wood or coal, of screams that carried across forests at night. Jewish communities in exile preserved the names of the dead through memorial books, prayers, and oral history, even when official recognition lagged behind. It was historians, archivists, and relentless witnesses who slowly rebuilt the story piece by piece. Court transcripts, railway records, SS correspondence, and perpetrator confessions, often given casually, even boastfully, began to reveal the scale and structure of the killing operation. By the 1960s and 1970s, scholars established that Operation Reinhard was not a side project, but the central mechanism of mass murder in occupied Poland, responsible for the deaths of approximately 2 million Jews in less than 2 years. Archaeology later confirmed what words alone could not. Ground-penetrating surveys and excavations uncovered mass graves, gas chamber foundations, personal belongings, and layers of human ash beneath landscapes long presented as empty. These discoveries shattered claims that the camps were exaggerated or invented, confronting denial with physical truth. Memorialization followed slowly and unevenly. For decades, Belzec had little more than a modest marker. Sobibor's site was neglected and poorly understood. Treblinka's memorial, though powerful, stood isolated from widespread education. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did these places receive the attention they demanded, not as ruins, but as deliberately erased crime scenes. Modern memorials reject reconstruction for spectacle. Instead, they emphasize absence, rupture, and names, communities destroyed rather than perpetrators glorified. Operation Reinhard's near erasure stands as one of its most chilling legacies. It demonstrates that genocide does not end with death alone. It seeks to annihilate memory, evidence, and mourning. The fact that this attempt failed is not accidental. It is the result of persistent human resistance against forgetting. Historians, survivors, descendants, and educators refuse to allow silence to become the final accomplice. Today, Operation Reinhard is understood not only as a set of camps, but as a warning encoded in history, that the most lethal systems may be those designed to leave no trace, that bureaucratic efficiency can kill as surely as weapons, and that remembrance itself is an act of defiance. As this documentary continues, we move from what the Nazis tried to erase toward how the world learned, slowly and painfully, to see what had been done, and why understanding this system in its entirety remains essential for preventing its repetition. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Justice Without Closure. Trials, Failures, and the Limits of Accountability. When the war ended and the machinery of Operation Reinhard lay buried beneath forests and false farms, the question facing the world was not only how such crimes had occurred, but whether justice could ever reach those responsible. In theory, the evidence was overwhelming. Millions murdered, entire communities erased, a paper trail of orders, transports, and personnel assignments stretching from Berlin to the killing pits of eastern Poland. In practice, accountability proved fragmented, delayed, and profoundly incomplete. The first attempts to address Nazi crimes emerged at the Nuremberg trials, where the concept of crimes against humanity entered international law. Yet Operation Reinhard itself was largely absent from the main proceedings. Many of its architects were already dead. Odilo Globoknik committed suicide after capture. Christian Wirth was killed by partisans. Hermann Höfel died in custody under unclear circumstances. Others vanished into post-war anonymity. Nuremberg focused on senior leadership and symbolic crimes, while the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where killing was nearly total and survival almost non-existent, received little direct attention. This absence shaped decades of misunderstanding. Without dramatic liberation footage, without thousands of survivors to testify, Operation Reinhard lacked the visibility that drove prosecutions elsewhere. West Germany, tasked with trying many perpetrators, faced immense obstacles. Destroyed evidence, fading memories, uncooperative witnesses, and a legal system ill-equipped to prosecute genocide. German courts often required proof of individual acts of murder rather than participation in a killing system, allowing defendants to claim they were merely following orders or performing administrative roles. The result was a series of trials that felt tragically disproportionate to the crimes committed. In the 1960s, landmark cases such as the Treblinka trials finally brought some perpetrators before the court. Guards and functionaries were confronted with survivor testimony describing gas chambers, beatings, deception, and the relentless pace of extermination. Yet sentences were frequently lenient, often just a few years in prison, based on arguments that defendants had not personally killed victims or had acted under duress. The law struggled to comprehend industrialized murder, where guilt was collective but responsibility was diffused across a system designed precisely to blur moral boundaries. Even more troubling were the cases that never reached trial at all. Many former SS men reintegrated into civilian life, working as clerks, businessmen, police officers, and civil servants. Some lived openly under their real names. Others quietly emigrated. The silence surrounding Operation Reinhard made this possible. Without public pressure, without widespread knowledge of these camps, there was little urgency to pursue justice. Survivors who testified often faced skepticism or re-traumatization, forced to recount horrors to audiences that struggled or refused to believe them. Justice, when it came, arrived decades late and rarely brought closure. For families who had lost everyone, no sentence could restore what had been taken. For historians, the trials revealed as much about post-war society as about wartime crimes. A reluctance to confront collective responsibility, a preference for legal technicalities over moral reckoning, and a deep discomfort with acknowledging how ordinary institutions enabled genocide. Internationally, Operation Reinhard influenced the evolution of human rights law, even if indirectly. Its legacy helped shape later definitions of genocide, command responsibility, and universal jurisdiction. Yet these advances came too late for most victims and too weakly enforced against most perpetrators. The absence of comprehensive justice underscores a painful truth. Law alone cannot fully address crimes of such magnitude, especially when societies prioritize forgetting over accountability. And yet, the trials, imperfect as they were, served an essential purpose. They preserved testimony, established historical records, and forced perpetrators to speak, often revealing details that no documents had recorded. Confessions, evasions, and contradictions exposed the mechanics of the camps in ways that denial could not erase. These courtrooms became secondary sites of memory, where the dead could no longer be silenced entirely. Operation Reinhard thus occupies a paradoxical place in the history of justice. It represents both a failure to punish genocide adequately and a foundational lesson in why international law must evolve beyond national boundaries and bureaucratic excuses. The limits of accountability do not diminish the crimes. They amplify the responsibility of remembrance. When courts could not deliver full justice, history assumed the burden. Understanding these failures is not an exercise in despair, but a warning, one that reminds us that systems capable of mass murder are often followed by systems capable of mass forgetting unless vigilance persists. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Memory Against Erasure. How Operation Reinhard Survived Oblivion. After the trials faded, after files were shelved and perpetrators returned to ordinary lives, Operation Reinhard faced a second death, this one not of bodies but of memory. Unlike Auschwitz, whose ruins stood as undeniable witnesses, the Reinhard camps had been deliberately dismantled, their bricks reused, their grounds plowed, their mass graves concealed beneath soil and pine trees. The Nazis had intended that nothing remain. No buildings, no survivors, no trace that millions had ever been murdered there. For decades, this plan nearly succeeded. Belzec became a quiet field, Sobibor a forest crossed by birdsong, Treblinka a patch of countryside where few visitors stopped. In schoolbooks and public consciousness, these names barely appeared, overshadowed by larger camps and more documented atrocities. The danger was not denial alone, but disappearance. The slow fading of a crime so complete it left almost no witnesses. Yet memory endured in fragile forms. A handful of survivors, fewer than 100 across all three camps, carried the burden of testimony. Their voices were often ignored, doubted, or marginalized, but they persisted. They described the arrival ramps, the forced undressing, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the screams, the smells, the endless rhythm of death that defined daily life. For years, these testimonies circulated quietly among historians, archivists, and small survivor communities, waiting for a world willing to listen. Beginning in the late 20th century, that listening slowly began. Archaeologists and forensic researchers returned to the sites, not to excavate graves, out of respect for Jewish law, but to map foundations, identify pathways, and confirm what the Nazis had tried to erase. At Treblinka, stones were placed to mark vanished towns. each representing a community annihilated. At Belzec, a stark memorial landscape was created, forcing visitors to walk through crushed stone and fractured terrain, mirroring the rupture left in history. Sobibor, once nearly forgotten, emerged again through renewed research and the rediscovery of personal artifacts. Keys, pendants, nameplates, silent proof of individual lives stolen by the system. Education became the final battleground against erasure. Scholars reframed Operation Reinhard not as a footnote, but as the central mechanism of the Holocaust's most intense killing phase. Museums incorporated its history into exhibitions. Documentaries reconstructed its operations with care and restraint. Archives digitized transport lists and SS correspondence to restore specificity to anonymous numbers. Each recovered name, each reconstructed timeline, weakened the Nazi goal of oblivion. Memory also survived through moral reckoning. Operation Reinhard exposed the extreme consequences of bureaucratic violence, the way genocide can be executed not by chaos, but by schedules, ledgers, and administrative calm. Remembering these camps forces an uncomfortable realization. The perpetrators were not monsters apart from humanity, but men shaped by ideology, obedience, and institutional reward. This understanding is not meant to excuse, but to warn. It demonstrates how modern systems, when stripped of ethics and accountability, can become engines of destruction. The legacy of Operation Reinhard, therefore, extends beyond history into responsibility. Its near erasure teaches that memory is not automatic. It must be defended. Silence, neglect, and simplification are forms of complicity that allow crimes to recede into abstraction. By preserving the truth of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the world resists not only denial, but repetition. These camps were designed to leave no trace, yet today they stand, through testimony, research, and memorialization, as some of the clearest evidence of what industrialized hatred can achieve when left unchecked. In the end, Operation Reinhard did not vanish. It survived in fragments, then in records, then in understanding. Its history reminds us that remembrance is an act of resistance, one that restores dignity to victims and imposes a duty on the living. As long as these stories are told, the silence the Nazis planned will never be complete, and the ghosts of the forests will continue to speak. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The Impossible Decision. Resistance inside a world built for death. By the time Operation Reinhard reached its most lethal efficiency, the idea of resistance inside the extermination camps seemed almost unthinkable. These were not labor camps where prisoners lived for months or years. They were not ghettos where underground networks could slowly form. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were places where most victims were murdered within hours of arrival, stripped of identity, clothing, and hope before they could even understand where they were. The camps were designed specifically to prevent resistance. Isolation, deception, terror, starvation, and constant surveillance ensured that fear ruled every moment. And yet, within this system built to annihilate all will, resistance did emerge, not as organized armies, but as desperate human refusal to die silently. Resistance inside Operation Reinhard did not begin with weapons or plans. It began with awareness. Prisoners forced into labor details, the Sonderkommando units who handled bodies, sorted belongings, repaired buildings, slowly realized the full truth of the camp's purpose. They saw transports arrive full and leave empty. They smelled the gas chambers before they saw them. They watched mass graves fill and then be reopened to burn the evidence. With this knowledge came a horrifying certainty. Survival through obedience was an illusion. No amount of work, loyalty, or submission would spare them forever. Death was inevitable unless something changed. This realization became the psychological foundation of resistance. It was not hope of victory that drove it, but the refusal to cooperate endlessly in one's own destruction. Planning resistance under such conditions required extraordinary courage and secrecy. Prisoners were malnourished, beaten, and constantly watched. Any hint of disobedience meant immediate execution, often followed by collective punishment. Communication between different labor groups was restricted, and the SS deliberately rotated workers to prevent bonds from forming. Still, whispers passed. A glance, a warning, a shared understanding that silence itself was killing them. In Sobibor and Treblinka especially, resistance began to take shape as prisoners quietly identified others who might be trusted. Former soldiers, craftsmen, men with organizational skills, and those who still possessed the strength to act. These early conspirators knew that escape alone was not enough. Even if a few survived, the camp would continue operating unless its machinery was disrupted. Resistance therefore took two forms: survival resistance and structural resistance. Survival resistance meant small acts of defiance. Stealing food, sabotaging equipment, slowing work, hiding valuables so they could not be reused by the SS. These acts did not stop the killings, but they preserved a fragment of agency in a system designed to erase it. Structural resistance aimed higher: mass escape, uprising, destruction of the camp itself. This form of resistance was almost suicidal, yet prisoners understood that death was already guaranteed. In Treblinka, this realization grew sharper as transports increased and the camp expanded in mid-1942. Prisoners saw entire regions vanish within weeks. They heard rumors, smuggled through railway workers or newly arrived victims, that similar camps existed elsewhere, all killing at the same pace. Operation Reinhard was not slowing down. It was accelerating. The SS grew complacent, believing the terror they had created was absolute. This arrogance became the resistance's only advantage. Guards drank heavily, routines became predictable, and weapons were stored carelessly. Prisoners assigned to workshops, armories, or administrative areas quietly memorized layouts and schedules. Each small observation became a thread in a plan that would eventually risk everything. What makes resistance within Operation Reinhard so extraordinary is not only that it happened, but that it happened without illusion. Prisoners did not believe they would overthrow the SS or end the Holocaust. They believed, instead, that resistance was a way to reclaim dignity in a place built to erase humanity entirely. It was a final assertion of choice in a system that denied choice at every level. To resist was to say, "You may control my body, but not my will." This mindset transformed terror into resolve. Fear did not disappear. It was absorbed, accepted, and carried forward. The decision to resist was therefore not a moment, but a process, one that unfolded quietly, invisibly, beneath the machinery of death. As Operation Reinhard reached its peak, the seeds of rebellion were already planted, waiting for the moment when despair would turn into action and silence would finally break. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Sobibor, the uprising that shattered the illusion of total control. Among the three Operation Reinhard camps, Sobibor became the place where resistance reached its most organized and devastating form, not because conditions were less brutal, but because circumstance, timing, and human resolve converged in a rare and dangerous alignment. Sobibor was smaller than Treblinka, hidden deep within forests near the Polish-Soviet border, designed for secrecy rather than scale, yet its purpose was the same: immediate extermination. Like the other camps, most prisoners were murdered within hours of arrival, but a small group was kept alive to maintain the machinery of death, sorting clothing, repairing buildings, burying bodies, and later burning them. These prisoners lived in constant terror, aware that their lives were temporary and disposable. By mid-1943, rumors reached Sobibor that Belzec had been dismantled and Treblinka might soon follow. Prisoners understood the meaning of this pattern. When a camp had finished killing, the Nazis erased it, along with all remaining witnesses. Sobibor's workers knew their time was running out. Into this environment arrived a transport of Jewish Soviet prisoners of war in September 1943, men who had survived combat, captivity, and extreme brutality on the Eastern Front. Among them was Alexander Petchersky, a Red Army lieutenant whose military discipline and leadership immediately stood out. Unlike many prisoners, he did not accept death as inevitable. He recognized that the SS were not invincible gods, but men, armed, yes, but complacent, predictable, and overconfident. Local resistance figures within the camp, including Leon Feldhendler, had already been considering escape plans, but previous attempts had failed disastrously. Petchersky's arrival changed the scale of ambition. Together, they conceived a plan not just to escape, but to destroy the camp's ability to function. The plan was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. Kill as many SS officers as possible silently, seize weapons, cut communications, and lead a mass breakout before reinforcements could respond. Every step required precision. Prisoners assigned to workshops lured individual SS men inside under pretexts of boot fittings or inventory checks, killing them quietly with axes and knives. The risk was absolute. One scream, one mistake, and everyone would be executed on the spot. As the killings began on October 14, 1943, fear and discipline clashed. Some prisoners froze. Others acted beyond expectation. Within hours, several SS officers were dead, weapons were seized, and the camp's illusion of control began to crack. When the alarm finally sounded, chaos erupted. Hundreds of prisoners ran toward the perimeter, through minefields, barbed wire, and gunfire. Many were killed instantly. Others were wounded, hunted down in the forests, or betrayed by locals in the days that followed. But some survived. Approximately 50 Sobibor prisoners lived to tell the story. For the Nazis, the uprising was catastrophic. It exposed the lie that extermination camps were perfectly controlled systems. Within weeks, Heinrich Himmler ordered Sobibor dismantled entirely. Buildings were destroyed, trees planted, the land flattened and disguised as a farm. The camp vanished physically but not historically. The Sobibor uprising forced the Nazi leadership to confront a truth they feared. Even in a place built exclusively for death, resistance was possible. The prisoners did not win in a military sense, but they achieved something more enduring. They disrupted the killing process, saved lives through escape, and preserved testimony that would later expose Operation Reinhard to the world. Sobibor became proof that genocide, no matter how mechanized, could never fully extinguish human agency. The uprising stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of defiance in the Holocaust, not because it succeeded easily, but because it was attempted at all in a place designed to make resistance unimaginable. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Erasing the Evidence. Operation 1005 and the Final Silence. After the uprisings and the near completion of Operation Reinhard's extermination goals, the Nazi leadership turned to the final phase of their plan, not killing but concealment. The same bureaucracy that had engineered mass murder now focused its precision on erasing every trace of it. This phase, later known as Operation 1005, was designed to eliminate physical evidence of genocide before advancing Allied forces could uncover it. Orders came from the highest levels of the SS. Mass graves were to be reopened, bodies exhumed, burned, crushed, and scattered. Camps were to be dismantled down to their foundations. Forests were to be replanted. Farms and houses were to be constructed over killing sites. Witnesses were to be murdered. At Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the work of destruction intensified. Prisoners were forced to dig up decomposing corpses, sometimes their own family members, stacking them on enormous pyres made from railway tracks and logs, doused with fuel and burned day and night. The smell of burning bodies spread for miles. Ashes were crushed into powder and dumped into rivers, fields, and pits, mixed with soil until nothing distinguishable remained. These tasks were assigned to Sonderkommando units who knew that once the work was finished, they too would be executed. The Nazis believed history itself could be manipulated, that without bodies, buildings, or documents, the crime would vanish into rumor. At Treblinka, after the 1943 uprising, the camp was systematically demolished. Barracks were torn down, gas chambers dismantled, fences removed. A farmhouse was built on the site, complete with a Ukrainian caretaker and livestock, to create the illusion of rural normalcy. At Sobibor, following the revolt, Himmler personally ordered the camp erased. The land was plowed and replanted with trees. Roads were redirected. Signs were removed. Belzec, already dismantled earlier, became a nearly featureless stretch of land, guarded for months to ensure no one approached. The SS were confident they had succeeded. Few survivors existed. Documentation was fragmented. The world was focused on the war's end, not the forests of eastern Poland. And yet, the erasure was never complete. Traces remained in the soil, in ash layers, in survivor testimony, in German paperwork, in railway records, in the memories of local populations who had seen the transports arrive and never depart. When Soviet forces liberated the region, they found little standing, but investigators sensed absence itself was evidence. Post-war trials, especially those in the 1960s, reconstructed Operation Reinhard piece by piece using fragments the Nazis failed to destroy. Survivor accounts from Treblinka and Sobibor, rare and invaluable, became central to understanding how the camps operated. Archaeological work decades later would uncover foundations, personal items, mass graves, and cremation remains, proving that the silence had been manufactured, not natural. Operation 1005 revealed one of the most chilling truths of the Holocaust. The perpetrators understood the magnitude of their crimes well enough to hide them. They knew what they had done was indefensible. The effort to erase evidence was an admission of guilt on a continental scale. Yet, in trying to destroy the past, the Nazis ensured something else. The memory of the crime became inseparable from the crime itself. The very act of concealment testified to the horror. Today, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka exist not as ruins of buildings, but as landscapes of memory. Their absence speaks louder than preserved walls. Operation Reinhard ended not with justice, but with silence, but it was a silence that could not last. History, pieced together from fragments, testimonies, and scars in the earth, reclaimed what the perpetrators tried to bury. And in that reclamation, the victims, meant to vanish without trace, were restored to memory, name by name, number by number, voice by voice. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Aftermath, Justice, Denial, and the Struggle to be Heard. When the killing centers of Operation Reinhard vanished into forests and fields, the war itself soon followed, but the end of Nazi Germany did not mean the end of suffering for the victims or clarity for the world. Instead, a new and painful chapter began, one defined by disbelief, denial, fragmented justice, and a long struggle to force truth into public memory. As Allied armies advanced across Europe in 1944 and 1945, they liberated concentration camps like Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, places where survivors remained alive to testify, where physical structures stood as undeniable proof of mass murder. But Operation Reinhard's camps were different. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had been dismantled with near-total efficiency, leaving almost no survivors and almost no visible ruins. And this absence shaped everything that followed. In the immediate post-war years, the world's attention focused on rebuilding, on displaced populations, on the Cold War, and on prosecuting the most visible Nazi leaders, while the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard slipped into the margins of public consciousness. At the Nuremberg trials, the Holocaust itself was not yet fully understood as a distinct crime. Prosecutors focused on aggressive war, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity, and while evidence of mass murder was presented, the specific machinery of Operation Reinhard remained largely unexplored. Many of the men who had designed and operated the death camps were dead, killed in battle, executed by the SS to silence them, or having taken their own lives, while others blended back into civilian life, protected by destroyed records, false identities, and the chaos of post-war Europe. Survivors of Treblinka and Sobibor, few in number and often traumatized beyond words, returned to societies that struggled to believe them. Their stories sounded too extreme, too systematic, too monstrous to be accepted easily, especially in a world eager to move forward rather than look back. In Poland, where the camps had operated, political upheaval and Soviet control complicated memory even further, as Jewish suffering was often subsumed into broader narratives of wartime loss, and anti-Semitism persisted even after the genocide. For years, Belzec remained little more than an unmarked field, Sobibor a quiet forest, Treblinka a place locals avoided but rarely discussed. Yet slowly, painstakingly, fragments of truth began to surface. German documents recovered from archives, railway schedules, budget records, and SS correspondence revealed a chilling paper trail that confirmed what survivors had said all along: that these camps were not improvised atrocities, but carefully planned extermination centers operating with industrial logic. Trials in West Germany during the 1960s, particularly the Treblinka trials in Dusseldorf, forced the crimes of Operation Reinhard back into public view, as former guards and officials were confronted with survivor testimony and their own signatures on transport orders and duty rosters. These trials were often frustratingly limited. Many perpetrators received light sentences or were acquitted due to lack of witnesses, but they shattered the illusion that the camps had been myths or exaggerations. Historians began reconstructing the camps from survivor sketches, aerial photographs, and testimonies, revealing layouts, killing processes, and daily routines with haunting precision. Archaeological investigations decades later uncovered mass graves, cremation pits, foundations of gas chambers, and personal items, keys, jewelry, fragments of prayer books, silent proof that genocide had occurred even where buildings no longer stood. Memorials were finally erected at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, not to recreate what had been destroyed, but to mark absence itself as evidence, to acknowledge that an entire system of murder had been designed to leave nothing behind. The aftermath of Operation Reinhard exposed a deeper truth about genocide: that its final stage is not only killing, but forgetting, and that justice delayed risks becoming justice denied. Yet despite the Nazis' efforts to erase their crimes, memory survived, in survivors' voices, in the soil of the camps, in the documents they failed to burn, and in the growing determination of historians, educators, and descendants to tell the story fully. Operation Reinhard did not end in 1943. Its consequences unfolded over decades, shaping how the world understands genocide, accountability, and the fragile line between civilization and annihilation. This chapter of Aftermath is not only about trials and memorials. It is about the ongoing fight against denial, indifference, and silence, and the realization that remembering is not automatic, but an act of responsibility that must be renewed by each generation. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Memory under Threat, Denial, Distortion, and the Battle for Historical Truth. As the decades passed after the destruction of Operation Reinhard's camps, the danger facing their memory did not come only from silence, but from distortion, minimization, and outright denial, a second erasure that threatened to complete what the Nazis had begun. Unlike Auschwitz, whose gates and barracks stood as visible testimony, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka existed largely in absence, and that absence became fertile ground for those who sought to question, relativize, or deny what had happened there. Holocaust denial movements, emerging in the post-war decades and gaining traction through pseudoscience and selective skepticism, fixated especially on Operation Reinhard because its camps left so few survivors and so little physical infrastructure behind. Deniers argued that without intact gas chambers or large numbers of witnesses, the camps could not have functioned as extermination centers, ignoring the overwhelming documentary evidence, forensic findings, and converging testimonies that proved otherwise. This distortion was not merely academic. It carried real consequences, reopening wounds for survivors and their families, undermining public understanding, and feeding broader currents of anti-Semitism and extremism. Governments, educators, and historians found themselves fighting a new battle, not to uncover the truth, but to defend it against deliberate falsification. In Germany, Poland, Israel, and beyond, courts ruled that Holocaust denial was not an opinion, but a form of hate speech rooted in historical falsehood, while scholars responded by publishing exhaustive studies that reconstructed Operation Reinhard in painstaking detail, camp by camp, transport by transport, victim by victim. These works demonstrated that genocide does not require monumental ruins to be real. It requires intent, organization, and victims, all of which Operation Reinhard possessed in horrifying abundance. Educational institutions gradually integrated these findings into curricula, emphasizing that the Holocaust was not confined to a single camp or method, but was a continent-wide system of murder in which Operation Reinhard represented its most efficient and lethal phase. At memorial sites, a new philosophy of remembrance emerged. Instead of rebuilding what had been destroyed, the sites would preserve emptiness, silence, and landscape as historical evidence. At Belzec, the memorial cuts through the earth itself, exposing layers of crushed stone and ash, a physical metaphor for lives buried and erased. At Sobibor, excavations revealed the path known as the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the road to the gas chambers, allowing visitors to walk the same route victims once did, confronting the reality of what occurred without spectacle or reconstruction. Treblinka's memorial field of stones, each representing a destroyed Jewish community, transformed abstraction into geography, reminding visitors that genocide is measured not only in numbers, but in the disappearance of entire worlds. Yet memory remained fragile, constantly challenged by political shifts, rising nationalism, and the passage of time that claimed the last living witnesses. As survivors aged and died, the burden of remembrance shifted to second and third generations, to historians, filmmakers, archivists, and educators tasked with preserving voices that could no longer speak for themselves. Recorded testimonies, once supplementary, became central, capturing not only facts but emotional truths. The confusion, fear, disbelief, and loss that statistics could never convey. At the same time, debates emerged over representation. How to tell the story of Operation Reinhard without sensationalizing suffering, how to convey its scale without numbing audiences, how to teach genocide in a way that warns rather than overwhelms. These questions underscored a deeper challenge. Memory is not static, but contested, shaped by culture, politics, and the values of each generation. The story of Operation Reinhard forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about Nazi perpetrators, but about collaboration, indifference, and the speed with which normal institutions can be repurposed for mass murder. Remembering the camps meant acknowledging that genocide was not committed by monsters alone, but by clerks, engineers, railway officials, and policemen who followed orders, filled out forms, and went home at night. This realization threatened comforting myths of exceptional evil and demanded a more unsettling lesson: that modernity itself, when stripped of moral restraint, can become an instrument of annihilation. The fight to preserve the memory of Operation Reinhard thus became inseparable from the fight to protect historical truth as a foundation of democratic society. Each archive opened, each denial challenged, each memorial visited represented a refusal to allow absence to become oblivion. In this ongoing struggle, remembrance is not only about honoring the dead, but about resisting the forces, hatred, apathy, and lies that made their deaths possible in the first place. Chapter 8, Segment 3, From Ashes to Warning. Why Operation Reinhard Still Matters. As the 20th century moved further into the past and the physical traces of Operation Reinhard continued to fade into forests and fields, the meaning of these camps shifted from immediate trauma to enduring warning, transforming sites of annihilation into moral landmarks that speak not only about what happened, but about what can happen again. The story of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka forces a confrontation with the most unsettling truth of the Holocaust: that genocide does not require vast armies on battlefields, nor dramatic spectacles of violence, but can unfold quietly through paperwork, scheduling, infrastructure, and routine obedience. Operation Reinhard demonstrated how modern states, using the tools of efficiency and administration, can convert prejudice into policy and policy into mass murder with terrifying speed. Railways that once carried civilians to markets and holidays were repurposed to deliver human beings to death. Architectural planning became a tool of deception. Language itself was weaponized, replacing murder with euphemisms like resettlement and special treatment. In this system, violence was hidden behind normality, and that concealment is precisely what makes Operation Reinhard so dangerous as a historical precedent. Its camps were not designed to last, to be conquered, or even to be seen. They were designed to function, destroy, and disappear, leaving behind as little evidence as possible. That design reflects a deeper lesson: that the absence of visible ruins does not mean the absence of crime, and that silence can be as intentional as noise. In the decades after the war, this understanding reshaped how genocide is studied and remembered, influencing the development of international human rights law, the definition of crimes against humanity, and the legal principle that genocide is punishable regardless of where it occurs. The Nuremberg trials, though limited in scope, set precedents that later courts would build upon, while the testimony of Operation Reinhard survivors, few though they were, became foundational evidence in the global effort to codify memory into law. Yet remembrance is not guaranteed by institutions alone. It depends on continual engagement by societies that choose to confront the past rather than sanitize it. As new generations encounter the story of Operation Reinhard, often for the first time, they do so in a world still marked by mass violence, ethnic cleansing, and ideological extremism, making the lessons of these camps painfully relevant. The camps reveal how quickly dehumanization can become normalized, how language can dull moral instincts, and how fear and conformity can silence opposition even among those who sense something is wrong. They also reveal the fragility of civilization itself, reminding us that progress does not move in a straight line, and that technological or cultural advancement offers no immunity against moral collapse. At the same time, the history of Operation Reinhard contains moments, rare, fragile, but vital, of resistance and human agency, from the revolts at Sobibor and Treblinka to the quiet acts of defiance by individuals who recorded names, hid evidence, or survived to testify. These moments do not redeem the horror, but they challenge the narrative of total victimhood, affirming that even in places designed to extinguish all choice, human beings still sought dignity, solidarity, and meaning. In memorial spaces today, visitors are often confronted not with reconstructed buildings, but with questions. How could this happen? Who made it possible? What would I have done? These questions are the true legacy of Operation Reinhard, extending beyond Jewish history or World War II into the broader human story. Remembering these camps is not an exercise in despair, but a call to vigilance, urging societies to recognize early warning signs: demonization, exclusion, bureaucratic cruelty, before they harden into irreversible systems. The forests of eastern Poland, once chosen for their isolation, now stand as open reminders that the most dangerous crimes are often those committed out of sight, with the cooperation of ordinary structures and ordinary people. To remember Operation Reinhard is to refuse the comfort of distance, to accept that the Holocaust was not an aberration of another age, but a product of choices, ideologies, and institutions that can reemerge whenever fear is allowed to override humanity. In this sense, the vanished camps speak louder than preserved ruins ever could, warning that memory itself must be actively maintained, defended, and passed on, because forgetting does not happen accidentally. It happens when silence is allowed to win. Chapter 9, Segment 1. After the death factories, the shock waves of Operation Reinhard. When Operation Reinhard officially ended in late 1943, the killing had stopped not because mercy had arrived, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. The Jewish population of occupied Poland had been almost entirely destroyed. Nearly 2 million men, women, and children had been murdered in less than 2 years, not in sprawling camp systems like Auschwitz, but in 3 tightly controlled extermination sites designed solely for death. What followed was not closure, but a profound and unsettling aftermath that rippled across Europe and the world. As the Nazis dismantled Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, plowed over mass graves, planted forests, and reassigned personnel, they attempted to erase not only evidence, but memory itself. The landscape was altered to suggest nothing had ever existed there, turning killing fields into quiet countryside, and this deliberate disappearance became one of the most disturbing legacies of Operation Reinhard. When the Red Army and Allied forces later advanced into former Nazi territory, they found ruins, documents, and survivors in other camps, but at Reinhard sites there was almost nothing to see. No barracks, no gas chambers standing, no piles of shoes or suitcases, just soil that had been turned, ash mixed into the earth, and silence so complete that many early investigators struggled to comprehend what had happened there at all. This absence complicated justice. Without physical camps to liberate or large survivor populations to testify, Operation Reinhard initially occupied a marginal place in post-war awareness, overshadowed by Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. Yet among those who had escaped or survived, figures like Rudolf Reder from Belzec, Thomas Blatt, and Samuel Willenberg from Sobibor and Treblinka, the need to speak became urgent. They understood that if they did not testify, these camps might vanish not only from the ground, but from history. Their accounts revealed a system so efficient and stripped down that it challenged even seasoned investigators. Trains arriving, people killed within hours, bodies burned, ashes scattered, and transports resuming as if on an industrial schedule. As post-war Europe struggled to rebuild, societies were often unwilling to confront these revelations. Many local populations had lived near the camps, seen the trains, smelled the burning bodies, heard the gunfire. Yet silence, fear, guilt, and anti-Semitism all contributed to a reluctance to engage. In some places, former collaborators reintegrated quietly into civilian life, while victims' voices went unheard. This silence was reinforced by the early Cold War, which shifted political priorities and limited cooperation between East and West, further delaying comprehensive investigations. It was only gradually, through war crimes trials, historical research, and survivor memoirs, that the true scale of Operation Reinhard began to emerge. The trials of SS personnel involved in Reinhard camps were fragmented and incomplete. Many perpetrators evaded justice, died before prosecution, or received relatively light sentences. Still, court records, interrogations, and confessions created an irrefutable paper trail, exposing how deeply the machinery of genocide had penetrated ordinary administrative structures. These records demonstrated that Operation Reinhard was not the work of a few sadistic individuals, but a coordinated effort involving planners, engineers, railway officials, guards, clerks, and local collaborators, each performing a task that, taken alone, could appear mundane, yet together formed a system of annihilation. As historians pieced together this evidence, Operation Reinhard came to be recognized not just as a chapter of the Holocaust, but as its deadliest phase, the moment when genocide reached its most concentrated and efficient form. This recognition forced a reevaluation of how genocide operates, not always through visible brutality, but through organization, compliance, and the normalization of atrocity. The aftermath of Operation Reinhard thus became a second struggle, this time over memory, responsibility, and meaning. Survivors fought against denial and minimization, historians fought against gaps and destruction of evidence, and society at large wrestled with the uncomfortable realization that the greatest mass murder in human history had occurred largely out of sight, in places deliberately designed to leave no trace. In that struggle, the legacy of Operation Reinhard began to shift from one of erasure to one of warning, reminding the world that the most dangerous crimes are often those carried out quietly, efficiently, and with the cooperation or indifference of many. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Justice delayed, memory contested, the long reckoning. In the years immediately following the war, the world struggled to comprehend the scale and mechanics of Operation Reinhard, and this confusion shaped the uneven pursuit of justice that followed. The very efficiency with which the camps had been built and erased worked against accountability. There were few surviving witnesses, minimal physical evidence, and a bureaucracy that had deliberately scattered documentation across agencies and destroyed much of it in the final months of the Reich. Early war crimes trials focused on prominent Nazi leaders and the most visible camp systems, while the architects and operators of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka often slipped into obscurity, blending back into post-war society under assumed identities or benefiting from the chaos of a divided Europe. Some Reinhard perpetrators were captured and interrogated, and their testimonies, often chilling in their banality, revealed a pattern of self-justification that would become familiar. Claims of obedience, denial of knowledge, minimization of responsibility. Many insisted they were mere cogs in a machine, following orders they neither designed nor questioned. Courts struggled with these defenses, particularly in the early decades when legal frameworks for prosecuting genocide were still evolving. As a result, sentences were frequently inconsistent, and in some cases shockingly lenient, reinforcing the painful reality that justice for the victims would be partial at best. At the same time, survivors carried the burden of memory into a world often unwilling to listen. Those who testified were sometimes met with skepticism, especially when their descriptions of extermination camps without labor selections or long-term prisoners seemed to defy existing assumptions about how camps functioned. The idea that hundreds of thousands could be murdered in places that left almost no trace challenged conventional understanding. And this gap was exploited by early deniers who claimed that the absence of ruins or mass graves proved exaggeration or fabrication. Combating this denial required painstaking historical work, correlating transport records, railway schedules, SS correspondence, survivor accounts, and forensic investigations of the sites themselves. Archaeological studies later confirmed what testimony had long asserted: layers of ash in the soil, human remains mixed with sand, fragments of personal belongings buried beneath fields that had been deliberately replanted. Each discovery reinforced the grim truth that absence was not evidence of innocence, but of a successful cover-up. As decades passed, a new generation of historians and educators began to place Operation Reinhard at the center of Holocaust scholarship, reframing it not as a peripheral episode, but as the core of the genocidal project. This shift had profound implications for how the Holocaust was understood. It emphasized that genocide does not require massive infrastructure or prolonged detention, only intent, organization, and compliance. Memorialization followed slowly. For years, the sites of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were neglected, marked by little more than modest plaques or informal remembrance by survivors and local Jewish communities. Eventually, dedicated memorials were established, designed not to reconstruct camps that had been erased, but to convey loss through absence: fields of stone, symbolic rail lines, pathways through silence. These memorials confronted visitors with the unsettling reality that what had happened there was meant to disappear, and that remembrance itself was an act of resistance against that erasure. In parallel, education became a battleground of memory. As survivor populations aged, the urgency of preserving testimony grew, leading to extensive oral history projects, archival digitization, and international efforts to standardize Holocaust education. Operation Reinhard, once overshadowed, became a critical case study in how modern states can mobilize ordinary systems, transportation, record-keeping, construction toward mass murder. This understanding carried contemporary relevance, serving as a warning that genocide is not an aberration of the distant past, but a process that can reemerge wherever dehumanization becomes policy and efficiency replaces ethics. Yet, even as recognition expanded, resistance persisted. Anti-Semitism, denial, and distortion did not vanish with time. They adapted, often cloaked in pseudo-academic language or conspiracy. Confronting these forces required more than facts alone. It demanded moral clarity and sustained commitment. The reckoning of Operation Reinhard thus extended beyond courtrooms and memorials into the realm of collective responsibility. How societies choose to remember, teach, and respond to evidence of mass atrocity. In this long struggle, the legacy of Reinhard became inseparable from the question of whether humanity could learn from its most meticulously organized crime, or whether silence and indifference would once again allow systems of destruction to take root. Chapter 9, Segment 3. The Echo That Remains. Operation Reinhard and the Moral Warning to the Future. As the 20th century moved toward its close and the voices of direct witnesses began to fade, Operation Reinhard assumed a new and unsettling role in human history, not only as a record of past atrocity, but as a permanent warning about how genocide is engineered, normalized, and repeated. Unlike narratives that focus solely on fanatical leaders or moments of mass violence, Reinhard exposed something more disturbing: the ordinariness of the system that enabled it. Clerks who stamped papers, railway officials who scheduled transports, engineers who optimized gas chambers, guards who learned to treat human beings as cargo, all participated in a structure where killing became routine work. This realization reshaped how historians, ethicists, and legal scholars understood crimes against humanity. Reinhard demonstrated that genocide does not require constant hatred or chaos. It requires administration, obedience, and the quiet surrender of conscience. In classrooms, museums, and memorial spaces, its story became central to discussions about responsibility, not only of perpetrators but of bystanders, collaborators, and institutions that chose efficiency over humanity. The camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka revealed how quickly a society can slide from exclusion to annihilation when law is stripped of morality and people are reduced to categories. This lesson carried into the post-war international order, influencing the drafting of human rights conventions, genocide law, and the principle that following orders is not a defense. Yet the legacy of Reinhard also exposed the fragility of these safeguards. Each resurgence of ethnic violence, each campaign of dehumanization framed as security or necessity, echoed familiar patterns. Survivors and scholars alike warned that the Holocaust was not an anomaly of German history, but a case study in what modern states are capable of when ideology overrides empathy. As memorials rose on the once-erased killing grounds, they were deliberately designed not to overwhelm with reconstructed horror, but to confront visitors with emptiness, spaces where absence itself testified to destruction. Walking these grounds meant standing where hundreds of thousands vanished without graves, names, or farewells, and recognizing that forgetting was the final goal of the perpetrators. Remembering, therefore, became an act of defiance. In the digital age, this responsibility expanded beyond physical sites into archives, films, and education accessible across the world. Operation Reinhard entered global consciousness not as a footnote, but as a core truth of the Holocaust, that the most lethal phase of genocide occurred not in sprawling camps with survivors to speak, but in places designed to leave almost no witnesses at all. This understanding reshaped how memory was preserved, emphasizing corroboration, documentation, and the protection of historical truth against distortion. At the same time, the moral weight of Reinhard challenged audiences to look inward. It forced uncomfortable questions about compliance, fear, and the human tendency to adapt to cruelty when it is normalized. The men who ran the camps were not monsters in isolation. They were products of a system that rewarded loyalty, punished dissent, and reframed murder as duty. Recognizing this did not absolve them, it deepened the indictment. It showed that the true danger lies not only in extremist ideology, but in societies that allow systems to operate without scrutiny, compassion, or resistance. In this way, Operation Reinhard became more than history. It became a mirror held up to every generation. Its echo remains in the demand it places on the present, to question authority when it dehumanizes, to protect truth when it is inconvenient, and to remember that genocide is not a single act of madness, but a process built step by ordinary people making ordinary choices. The final legacy of Reinhard is therefore not confined to the forests of Poland or the ashes beneath the soil. It lives in the responsibility to ensure that no system, no matter how efficient or lawful it appears, is ever allowed to turn human beings into numbers again. Chapter 10, Segment 1. After the ashes, the collapse of Operation Reinhard and the world that followed. When Operation Reinhard officially ended in late 1943 and early 1944, it did not conclude with liberation, justice, or public reckoning. It ended in silence, smoke, and deliberate forgetting. By the time the last transports ceased and the final bodies were burned or buried, nearly 2 million people had been murdered in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and the Nazi state had already begun dismantling the evidence of its most efficient killing operation. Camps were torn down, buildings erased, mass graves exhumed and burned, trees planted over ash fields, and farms constructed to disguise the ground beneath. The SS officers who had overseen the extermination were reassigned, promoted, or sent to other fronts, carrying their expertise in mass killing into new roles. For the victims, there was no closure. Entire communities had vanished so completely that, when the war ended, there were towns with no Jews left alive to testify to what had happened. As Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, they uncovered camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek, where survivors remained, but the Reinhard camps, designed explicitly to leave almost no witnesses, were largely absent from early public understanding of the Holocaust. This absence shaped the immediate post-war years. The world was overwhelmed by the scale of Nazi crimes, yet the very efficiency of Operation Reinhard worked against memory. With few survivors and no standing structures, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were initially overshadowed by camps that still existed physically. Meanwhile, Europe itself lay in ruins, and millions were displaced, starving, or dead. Justice moved slowly and unevenly. Some perpetrators were captured and tried, but many vanished into post-war chaos, blending into civilian life or fleeing abroad. The architects of Operation Reinhard, including Odilo Globoknik and Christian Wirth, evaded full accountability. Wirth died in 1944, Globoknik committed suicide in 1945, and others faced limited or delayed prosecution. The trials that did occur revealed a chilling pattern. Defendants minimized their roles, claimed ignorance, or framed themselves as mere functionaries. Courts struggled to confront crimes that had been bureaucratic rather than visibly sadistic, systematic rather than spontaneous. This exposed a profound challenge for post-war justice: how to prosecute genocide when it was carried out not by rogue killers, but by an entire administrative machine. At the same time, survivors who had escaped Reinhard camps or nearby ghettos faced a different struggle: being believed. Their testimonies described places where nearly everyone was killed within hours, where gas chambers operated continuously, and where no labor system existed to leave survivors behind. Early listeners sometimes doubted these accounts, not out of malice, but because the scale and speed of killing defied imagination. Yet slowly, through corroboration, documents, and the courage of witnesses, the truth emerged. The Holocaust began to be understood not as a single camp or event, but as a layered system of persecution, deportation, and extermination, within which Operation Reinhard represented its deadliest core. In the emerging international order, these revelations reshaped global law and ethics. The United Nations Genocide Convention, the Nuremberg Principles, and later human rights frameworks were influenced directly by the realization that modern states could engineer mass murder through legal structures and administrative processes. Reinhard demonstrated that genocide did not require lawlessness. It could be carried out through laws, decrees, and schedules. This understanding forced societies to reconsider the relationship between obedience and morality, between legality and justice. It also exposed the dangers of indifference. Many people living near Reinhard camps had seen transports arrive, heard screams, smelled burning flesh, and watched smoke rise daily. Yet survival, fear, and normalization dulled resistance. This did not make them murderers, but it revealed how silence could coexist with atrocity. As decades passed, historians returned to Operation Reinhard with renewed urgency, recognizing that forgetting had been part of the crime itself. Archaeological studies, archival discoveries, and survivor accounts pieced together what the Nazis tried to erase. Memorials were eventually built not as replicas, but as landscapes of absence, spaces designed to force confrontation with loss rather than spectacle. In these places, the absence of buildings became the message. Here, human beings were turned into nothing, and even their destruction was meant to vanish. Chapter 10 begins not with an ending, but with the long aftermath of a system that reshaped the moral boundaries of the modern world. Operation Reinhard did not die with the Third Reich. Its lessons lingered in law, memory, denial, and responsibility. The collapse of the camps marked the end of the killing, but the struggle to understand, remember, and prevent such a system from ever rising again had only just begun. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Memory under threat, denial, distortion, and the struggle to remember Operation Reinhard. In the years following the collapse of Nazi Germany, the memory of Operation Reinhard entered a fragile and dangerous phase, not only because the camps had been physically erased, but because remembrance itself became contested terrain. Unlike Auschwitz, which stood as a sprawling complex of barracks, gates, and ruins that could be photographed and visited, the Reinhard camps existed largely as absences in forests and fields, marked only by disturbed earth and scattered ash. This physical erasure created fertile ground for denial, minimization, and distortion, allowing some to claim that what could not be seen had not existed, or that what had happened was exaggerated, misunderstood, or misattributed. Holocaust denial did not emerge immediately as a mass movement, but from the very beginning there were individuals and groups eager to recast the narrative. Former perpetrators seeking to absolve themselves, sympathizers attempting to rehabilitate Nazism, and ideologues determined to undermine the moral reckoning that followed the war. Operation Reinhard, with its lack of surviving infrastructure and minimal number of eyewitnesses, became a prime target. Denial often took subtle forms at first, questioning victim numbers, reframing extermination camps as transit centers, or insisting that deaths were the result of disease and chaos rather than design. These narratives were not merely false, they were a continuation of violence, attempting to erase victims a second time by stripping their suffering of meaning. Survivors and historians found themselves fighting not only for justice, but for the very existence of truth. Testimony became a battleground. Those who had escaped Treblinka or Sobibor were interrogated repeatedly, asked to recount horrors in painstaking detail, often before audiences unprepared or unwilling to listen. Many survivors carried guilt for having lived when others did not, and denial weaponized that pain, accusing witnesses of fabrication or self-interest. At the same time, archives began to open. German documents, transport lists, SS correspondence, and post-war interrogations revealed a paper trail that confirmed survivor accounts with chilling precision. These records exposed how Operation Reinhard functioned as a centralized program, complete with budgets, staffing plans, construction schedules, and reporting systems. The language was sanitized: special treatment, resettlement, processing. But when decoded, it revealed a machinery built solely for murder. Historians painstakingly reconstructed timelines, identifying how deportations flowed from ghettos to death camps, how gas chambers were expanded, and how mass graves were later exhumed and burned to destroy evidence. Archaeology played a critical role where documents were missing. At Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor, non-invasive forensic methods uncovered mass burial sites, layers of ash, fragments of bone, personal items, and remnants of structures, all silent witnesses buried beneath soil and vegetation. These findings transformed absence into proof, countering denial with material reality. Yet remembrance faced another challenge beyond outright denial: fading attention. As decades passed, global focus shifted to new conflicts and tragedies. Survivors aged and died, taking with them living memory. Education systems varied widely in how they taught the Holocaust, sometimes emphasizing broader themes while overlooking specific operations like Reinhard. This raised a critical question: how does memory survive when those who experienced events firsthand are gone? Memorialization efforts attempted to answer this. Unlike traditional monuments, Reinhard memorials avoided reconstruction, choosing instead to preserve emptiness. At Treblinka, thousands of stone markers represent destroyed Jewish communities, each engraved with names of towns whose populations vanished. At Belzec, a vast field of crushed stone covers the ground, forcing visitors to walk across a symbolic grave. These spaces reject spectacle and invite reflection, confronting visitors with scale, loss, and the finality of extermination. Education initiatives expanded beyond museums, incorporating survivor testimony into digital archives, academic curricula, and public history projects. Yet memory remains vulnerable not only to denial but to simplification. Operation Reinhard risks being reduced to statistics, its victims abstracted into numbers rather than individuals with lives, families, languages, and cultures. True remembrance resists this flattening. It insists on complexity, that genocide was not inevitable, that it required choices at every level, and that ordinary systems, railways, offices, forms, schedules, can become instruments of destruction when ideology strips people of humanity. Chapter 10's second segment confronts a difficult truth. Memory does not preserve itself. It must be defended, renewed, and transmitted intentionally. Operation Reinhard was designed to vanish without trace, and in many ways it nearly succeeded. That it is remembered at all is the result of survivor courage, scholarly rigor, and moral refusal to accept silence. In a world where denial resurfaces and history is politicized, remembering Reinhard is not only about honoring the dead, it is about recognizing how easily systems of mass violence can be concealed, normalized, and forgotten if vigilance fades. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The final lesson: what Operation Reinhard teaches the modern world. Operation Reinhard did not end when the last camp was dismantled or when the final transport lists were filed away. It continues to exist as a warning embedded in history, one that speaks not only to what happened between 1942 and 1943, but to what can happen whenever ideology, bureaucracy, and indifference converge. The most unsettling lesson of Reinhard is not simply the scale of the murder, but the method by which it was achieved. There was no single moment when genocide suddenly appeared in full form. Instead, it emerged through incremental decisions, each one justified as temporary, necessary, or administrative. Laws redefined citizenship, then rights. Ghettos were framed as protective or transitional. Deportations were described as resettlement. Murder was concealed behind euphemisms like special treatment. Each step appeared manageable, even rational, when viewed in isolation. Together, they formed a system that normalized annihilation. This is why Operation Reinhard remains uniquely instructive. It demonstrates how genocide does not require chaos alone, but can be executed through order, planning, and compliance. The people who enabled it were not all fanatics or sadists. Many were clerks, engineers, railway officials, guards, and civil servants who performed tasks within defined roles, often claiming they never saw the full picture. Reinhard exposes the danger of fragmented responsibility, where no single individual feels accountable for the outcome, yet the outcome becomes catastrophic. The camps themselves embodied this logic. They were not prisons or labor centers, but nodes in a network designed for speed and efficiency. Victims were not meant to live long enough to be known, remembered, or counted individually. Their destruction was the objective, not a byproduct. Even resistance, when it occurred, was met with escalation. More secrecy, faster killing, deeper erasure. And yet, within this system, humanity did not fully disappear. Prisoners who smuggled messages, who sabotaged machinery, who rose in revolt at Sobibor and Treblinka, demonstrated that moral choice persists even under extreme coercion. Their actions did not save millions, but they shattered the Nazi illusion of total control. Post-war justice, though incomplete, further challenged that illusion. The trials showed that following orders was not an acceptable defense, and that crimes committed within a system remain crimes. Still, justice was partial, memory uneven, and accountability delayed. This unevenness underscores another lesson of Reinhard, that the end of violence does not automatically produce understanding. Without sustained effort, atrocities fade into abstraction. Numbers replace names. Places become footnotes. The danger is not only forgetting but misremembering, treating genocide as a historical anomaly rather than a human capacity. Operation Reinhard forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about modernity itself. The same tools that enable prosperity, transportation networks, data systems, administrative efficiency, can be repurposed for destruction when guided by exclusionary ideology. The lesson is not that technology is evil, but that values must govern its use. When a society defines some lives as expendable, systems will adapt to make that definition real. Education, therefore, becomes an act of prevention. Teaching Operation Reinhard is not about inducing guilt in later generations, but about cultivating awareness. Understanding how language can dehumanize, how obedience can override conscience, and how silence can function as consent. The memory of Reinhard demands active engagement, not passive commemoration. It asks modern societies to scrutinize how they categorize people, how they treat minorities, how power is exercised and justified. It challenges institutions to recognize warning signs, legal discrimination, propaganda, normalization of cruelty, before they harden into policy. In this sense, Operation Reinhard is not only a chapter of the Holocaust. It is a case study in how genocide becomes possible within a modern state. Its victims were murdered in secret forests and camps designed to vanish, yet their absence speaks loudly. Every uncovered document, every preserved testimony, every memorial stone counters the original intent to erase them completely. The final lesson of Reinhard is stark and enduring. Genocide does not begin with killing, and it does not end with liberation. It begins with ideas and ends with memory, or with its failure. To remember Operation Reinhard is to accept responsibility for vigilance, to recognize that the line between civilization and atrocity is thinner than comfort allows, and to affirm that remembrance itself is a form of resistance against the return of systems built to destroy. Operation Reinhard was designed to leave no witnesses, no ruins, and no memory. The forests were replanted. The camps were dismantled. The ashes were scattered. The perpetrators believed that time, silence, and distance would finish what murder began. They were wrong. What remains today is not only the record of how nearly 2 million people were exterminated, but the understanding of how it was done, methodically, bureaucratically, and deliberately. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were not accidents of war. They were the result of choices made step by step, form by form, train by train. They show us that genocide does not require chaos. It can thrive within systems that appear orderly, legal, and efficient. This documentary has not been about statistics alone, but about mechanisms, how ideology becomes policy, how language disguises cruelty, how obedience replaces conscience, and how an entire society can be trained to look away. Operation Reinhard teaches us that the most dangerous crimes are often committed quietly, far from the battlefield, by people who believe they are simply doing their jobs. Yet even in places built solely for death, humanity did not vanish completely. Acts of resistance, however small, proved that the system was never absolute. Memory itself is one of those acts. Every name remembered, every story told, every truth preserved is a direct defiance of the erasure the Nazis intended. To remember Operation Reinhard is not to dwell in the past. It is to guard the future. It is to recognize early signs of dehumanization, to question systems that divide lives into those that matter and those that do not, and to understand that silence is never neutral. The Holocaust did not begin with camps, and it did not end when they closed. Its lessons remain unfinished. As the story fades into quiet, the responsibility does not. The victims of Operation Reinhard were denied graves, voices, and justice in their lifetimes. What remains is the duty of remembrance, not as ritual but as vigilance. May their memory endure. May history be confronted honestly. And may the systems that made this possible never be allowed to rise again.